Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. Tonight we're stepping back 2,000 years, past the noise of the modern world, past highways and electric lights and the hum of refrigerators, all the way to a cold stone fort on the edge of the known world, where a Roman soldier is pulling on his boots before the sun has even thought about rising. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, tell me where you are listening from tonight, and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Now dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Before we begin, who was the Roman soldier? There is a version of the Roman soldier that lives in the popular imagination. He is tall, impossibly clean, wearing a gleaming helmet with a magnificent red crest. His breastplate catches the light. His sandals are perfectly laced. He stands with the confident posture of a man who has never once been cold, hungry, homesick, or uncertain about anything at all. He looks, frankly, like he was designed by a committee trying to sell something. That man did not exist. The real Roman soldier was something altogether more complicated and, if we are being honest, far more interesting. He was a young man, often very young, who signed his name or pressed his mark on a document he may not have fully understood, handed over a large portion of his life to an institution that would tell him where to sleep, what to eat, when to march, and how to hold a shield. He was sometimes brave, sometimes terrified, frequently bored, occasionally furious, and almost always tired. He wrote letters home asking for socks. He gambled away his wages. He argued with his bunkmates over whose turn it was to clean the latrine. He prayed to gods he could not see about battles he was not sure he would survive. He was, in short, a human being, and tonight we are going to spend a day with him. Now I want to be upfront about something before we begin, because I think it matters. When we talk about the Roman soldier, we are not talking about a single man in a single time and place. The Roman military spanned roughly 1,000 years if you count both the Republic and the Empire, and the experience of a soldier fighting under Julius Caesar in Gaul around 50 BCE was meaningfully different from the experience of a soldier stationed along Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain around 130 CE, which was again different from a soldier defending the crumbling frontiers of the late Empire in the 300 CE. Armour changed, pay changed, tactics changed. The political reality of Rome itself changed dramatically. So for the purposes of tonight, we are going to plant ourselves in a specific moment. We are going to spend our day with a soldier of the early imperial period, roughly the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, which is arguably the height of Roman military power and the period from which we have the richest historical evidence. Think of the Emperor Trajan, who reigned from 98 to 117 CE, or Hadrian, who followed him. This was Rome at something close to its peak. The empire stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the highlands of Scotland, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the Euphrates River in what is now Syria and Iraq. The legions that held this extraordinary expanse together were the backbone of everything Rome claimed to be. Our soldier, let us call him Marcus for the sake of simplicity, though he might just as easily have been called Gaius or Titus, or any number of names common among Romans of his era, is not a general. He is not even a junior officer. He is a Miles Gregarius, a common foot soldier, an ordinary legionary. The kind of man who appears in the background of history rather than at its centre, who built the roads and dug the ditches and stood in the shield wall and marched 20 miles in the rain, and did not make it into any of the famous histories precisely because he was too busy doing the actual work of empire to be celebrated for it. That invisibility is itself worth pausing on. The great historians of Rome, men like Tacitus and Livy and Suetonius, wrote about emperors and generals and political intrigues. They wrote about battles in the aggregate, about tactics and outcomes and the grand sweep of military campaigns. But the man who actually stood in the mud and swung the sword and dug the trench and carried the 80-pound pack is largely absent from their pages. He appears occasionally in anecdotes, sometimes named, more often nameless. A soldier who said something funny to a general. A man who performed an act of extraordinary courage and received a medal for it. A group of troops who mutinied over their pay. But the daily texture of his life, the ordinary hours between the dramatic ones, was rarely considered worth recording by the men who had the power to record things. That is where archaeology steps in, and this is one of the places where history becomes genuinely exciting. Because even though the literary sources largely ignored the common soldier, the ground did not. Forts have been excavated across the Roman world, and what has been found inside them is extraordinary in its mundane detail. Writing tablets scratched with shopping lists and letters home. Leather shoes, children's shoes among them, suggesting that soldiers' families sometimes lived nearby. Gambling dice, gaming boards, medical instruments, animal bones from meals, amphoras that once held wine and fish sauce, personal seal rings, combs, needles, the artifacts of ordinary life preserved by 2,000 years of soil. These objects tell us something the literary sources cannot. They tell us that the Roman soldier was, first and foremost, a person. Not a symbol or a prop for imperial ambition, but an individual with preferences and habits and relationships, and a sense of humour, and a craving for particular foods, and a deep, entirely understandable desire to know when he was going to go home. So that is who we are spending the night with tonight. Not a hero from a painting, not a figure from a triumphal arch. An ordinary man doing an extraordinary job in one of the most remarkable military institutions the ancient world ever produced. And honestly, he deserves a documentary. The world Rome built, setting the stage to understand the Roman soldier. You first need to understand the world that created him, and the world he was expected to maintain. Because the Roman Empire was not simply a large country, it was an almost incomprehensible undertaking, a project of governance and violence and engineering and cultural assimilation that sprawled across 3 continents and encompassed somewhere between 50 and 90 million people at its height, depending on which historian you ask, and historians, bless them, love to argue about this sort of thing. At the beginning of the 2nd century CE, the empire reached from the rainy western coast of Britain to the eastern border of Mesopotamia. It included the entire Mediterranean coastline, which Romans somewhat charmingly called Mare Nostrum, our sea, as though the Mediterranean were a nice private pond they happened to own. It incorporated the Rhine and Danube river frontiers in the north, beyond which lay the Germanic and Dacian tribes that Rome had spent considerable energy, either fighting, bribing, or occasionally incorporating into the army. In the south, Roman authority extended deep into North Africa, into the Saharan fringe, into regions that are today Algeria, Morocco, Libya, and Egypt. In the east, the empire bordered the powerful Parthian Empire, a rival civilization that Rome respected enough to be genuinely anxious about. Holding all of this together required roads. The Romans understood something about infrastructure that many later empires would rediscover the hard way. An army that cannot move quickly is an army that cannot respond to crisis. And in an empire as vast and varied as Rome's, crises were essentially a permanent condition. There was always a frontier being probed, a province grumbling about taxes, a local strongman deciding that he fancied the look of that title, emperor. The road network that the legions built and maintained, and we will talk much more about the building side of things later, was not simply a convenience, it was the nervous system of empire. It was how information moved, how taxes were collected, how troops were deployed, how the whole extraordinary machine stayed more or less functional. At its height, the Roman road network covered something in the range of 400,000 kilometres, of which approximately 80,000 kilometres were paved stone roads. To put that in some kind of perspective, that is roughly equal to the circumference of the Earth multiplied by 10, and a significant portion of those roads are still partially visible today, which is either a testament to Roman engineering or a fairly pointed commentary on what happens when you build things properly. Probably both. The frontiers themselves were a world apart from the cosmopolitan cities of the empire's interior. If you were a soldier stationed in Rome or Carthage or Alexandria or Antioch, life had a certain urban texture to it. There were theatres and baths and markets and the general hubbub of civilization. But the vast majority of the Roman military was not stationed in cities. It was stationed on the edges, along the Rhine, along the Danube, in the deserts of Syria, in the hills of Judea, in the windswept north of Britain, staring across a stone wall at a fog bank that might or might not contain angry Caledonians. These frontier postings were where the bulk of the Roman military machine lived out its days, and they shaped the character of Roman military culture profoundly. Life on the frontier was defined by distance. Distance from Rome, distance from family, distance from the things that made life comfortable and recognizable. A soldier posted to a fort on the Rhine was, by the standards of his time, extraordinarily far from home. If he had come from central Italy or the Spanish provinces or North Africa, the journey to his posting might have taken weeks on foot and by boat, and once he arrived, he was expected to stay. The standard term of service in the imperial legions was 25 years. 25 years. Let that settle for a moment. The Roman military machine itself was organised around the legion, which we will explore in much more detail shortly, but the basic outline is worth establishing here. In the early imperial period, Rome maintained roughly 30 legions, each nominally 5,000 to 6,000 men strong, though in practice the numbers fluctuated depending on losses, recruitment, and the eternal problem of soldiers who technically existed on the rolls but had somehow managed to make themselves very difficult to locate. Each legion was a self-contained military and administrative unit. It had its own number, its own eagle standard, its own identity, its own traditions and history, and crucially, its own collective pride. Soldiers identified with their legion the way people today might identify with a sports team, except with considerably more existential stakes attached. Beyond the legions, Rome also maintained auxiliary units, troops recruited from the provinces and allied peoples outside Italy. These auxiliaries brought specialized skills that the legions lacked: Syrian archers, North African cavalry, Balearic slingers, Batavian swimmers, which sounds almost too specific to be real but was absolutely a thing. The Batavians from the Rhine Delta were genuinely renowned for their ability to cross rivers in full armour. The auxiliaries were paid less than legionaries, served longer in some cases, and were promised Roman citizenship at the end of their service. They were an essential part of the Roman military system, and are often overlooked in favour of the more glamorous legions. Together, the legions and auxiliaries represented a standing military force of perhaps 400,000 to 500,000 men, scattered across the length and breadth of the Roman world. They were the mechanism by which Rome projected power, maintained order, and reminded the people within its borders, and the people just outside them, that crossing Rome was an extraordinarily poor idea. And at the base of all of this, doing the actual work, standing the actual watches, digging the actual ditches, was Marcus, our soldier, our tired, muddy, hungry, occasionally philosophical, thoroughly human representative of one of the greatest military institutions in history. Let us follow him through his day. Becoming a soldier, enlistment and training. Before we can spend a day with Marcus, we need to understand how he got there, because becoming a Roman soldier was not as simple as walking up to a recruiting station and saying you fancied to go. Well, sometimes it was almost exactly that simple, but the process that followed was anything but. The decision to join the legions was shaped by a complex mixture of personal circumstance, social pressure, economic calculation, and in some cases what we might charitably call limited alternatives. The legions recruited primarily from Roman citizens, a distinction that sounds straightforward, but was in practice constantly evolving. By the later Republic and early Empire, citizenship had spread well beyond Italy into the provinces, meaning that a young man from Spain or Gaul or the Danube provinces might be a perfectly legitimate recruit for the legions. He did not need to speak Latin at home or come from an Italian family. He needed to be a citizen, to be physically capable and to be willing. The economic reality of Roman provincial life was a significant driver of recruitment. Young men from farming families in the provinces often faced a fairly stark set of options. Work the land, often as tenant farmers on someone else's property. Seek work in a city which was competitive, unstable, and frequently miserable. Or join the army, which offered a guaranteed wage, food, equipment, housing, medical care of a kind, and the extraordinary prize at the end of 25 years of a lump sum payment and, if you were an auxiliary rather than a legionary, Roman citizenship itself. For a young man without prospects, the legions represented something genuinely appealing: structure, belonging, the possibility of travel, in the sense that you would absolutely see parts of the world you had never imagined, even if seeing those parts involved carrying a very heavy pack up a very steep hill in the rain. The recruiting process began with what the Romans called the probatio, the testing or examination. A prospective recruit would appear before a recruiting officer and submit to physical inspection. The requirements were specific. He needed to be of a certain height, which varied somewhat by period but was generally around 5 feet 7 or 8 inches in Roman terms, which is roughly similar to modern measurements. He needed to be free of obvious physical defects. He needed to be able to demonstrate basic fitness. Flat feet were apparently a genuine disqualifying condition, which makes a certain practical sense when you consider that the man was going to spend the next 25 years walking enormous distances. Beyond the physical, recruiters looked for evidence of good character and a sound background. Letters of recommendation were helpful. Family connections to military service were noted positively. Evidence of training in any relevant skill, horsemanship, archery, metalwork, was an advantage. The Romans were practical about military recruitment in the way they were practical about most things. They were not looking for natural warriors in some romantic sense. They were looking for raw material they could shape into something useful, and shape they did. The training that followed probatio and the formal swearing of the military oath, the sacramentum, was systematic in a way that no previous military tradition had quite matched. The Romans had essentially invented the concept of standardized military training, and they were deeply committed to it. Not because they were particularly sentimental about education, but because they had worked out through considerable and painful experience that a trained soldier was worth several untrained ones, and that the difference between a disciplined formation and a mob was the difference between victory and catastrophe. Training began with physical conditioning. The new recruit, the tiro, was expected to march. Not occasionally, not as a sometimes activity, constantly. The Romans believed, with the kind of conviction that can only come from centuries of empirical evidence, that a soldier who could march 20 miles a day under full pack, in good order, in any weather, was a soldier who could be deployed anywhere and expected to fight effectively at the end of the journey. The standard Roman marching pace was roughly 20 Roman miles per day, which works out to about 18 modern miles, in summer, under normal conditions. For a legionary carrying a pack that might weigh anywhere from 40 to 70 pounds, depending on what equipment and rations he was carrying and which historian you are reading. The training marches were designed to build this capacity incrementally. New recruits started with lighter loads and shorter distances. They progressed through a sequence of increasingly demanding exercises as their bodies adapted. The Romans understood the basic principle of progressive physical training, with a clarity that their later successors in military history would spend centuries rediscovering. Alongside marching came weapons training. This was conducted, at least initially, with wooden practice weapons against training posts called parlii. The practice weapons were deliberately made heavier than actual combat equipment, on the theory that if you trained with something heavier, the real thing would feel lighter and you would hit harder. This is, as it happens, not entirely accurate biomechanically, but as a psychological strategy for building confidence, it was probably reasonably effective. The recruits practiced the basic movements of Roman infantry combat, the thrust rather than the slash, because a thrusting weapon can be used from behind a shield without exposing the body, the shield block, the combination of movements that made the legionaries' close-quarters fighting style so devastatingly effective. Swimming was also part of training. The Romans were serious about this. An army that could not cross rivers was an army that geography could defeat without a fight. The legions were expected to be able to swim in full equipment, or to improvise river crossings when swimming was not practical. There are accounts of legionaries crossing rivers using their shields as improvised floats, stuffed with bundles of reeds or straw. Whether this worked as well in practice as it sounds in the accounts is perhaps worth some skepticism. But the point is that water was not considered an insurmountable obstacle. The soldier also learned to build. This is a point so significant to the Roman military experience that it deserves its own chapter, and it will get one shortly, but it is worth introducing here in the context of training. Roman soldiers were taught the basics of military engineering as part of their standard formation. Every legionary was expected to know how to dig a defensive ditch, how to construct a rampart, how to build a marching camp from scratch at the end of each day's march. The building skills were not considered a separate specialty. They were considered as fundamental as sword technique, which tells you something quite profound about what Rome believed war actually was. By the time a recruit had completed his training period, which lasted somewhere between 3 and 4 months in formal instruction, though the learning never really stopped, he was a different person from the young man who had walked in. His body was harder. His reflexes were trained. His mind had been shaped by the rhythms of military discipline in ways that would never entirely leave him. He had learned to sleep when and where he could, to eat what was available, to follow orders without hesitation, and to trust the man beside him with his life, because that trust was not metaphorical. It was entirely literal. He had also sworn the sacramentum, the military oath, which bound him to the emperor and the Roman state in terms that the Roman mind took with absolute seriousness. Breaking the oath was not merely a legal offence, it was a form of spiritual pollution, a severing of the relationship between the soldier and the divine order that sanctioned Roman power. This was not cynical theatre. Roman soldiers believed in their oath. It was part of what made the legion so extraordinarily reliable as a military instrument. The man who has sworn before the gods is harder to persuade to run away than the man who has merely agreed to show up. Marcus, somewhere between the ages of 17 and 25 when he enlisted, had gone through all of this. He had been tested and shaped and sworn and trained. He had been assigned to his unit and his bunkmates and his centurion. He had received his equipment and his initial kit, and the long, slightly complicated document that explained exactly how his pay was going to be deducted for various expenses before he ever saw any of it. He had become, in the phrase that still resonates across 2,000 years of military history, a soldier. Now let's see what that actually meant from sunrise to sunset. The legion: structure, brotherhood, and belonging. You cannot understand a day in Marcus's life without understanding the institution that structured every moment of it. The Roman legion was not simply a collection of armed men. It was a community, a bureaucratic organism, a fighting machine, and in many ways a complete social world. Marcus did not simply work for the legion. He lived inside it, in a way that modern civilian life makes genuinely difficult to imagine. The basic unit of the Roman legionaries' daily existence was the contubernium, a word that translates roughly as tent group or mess group. 8 men. 8. That was the foundational social unit of the Roman military. These 8 men shared a tent in the field and a pair of rooms in the fort barracks. They ate together, cooked together, cleaned their equipment together, stood watch together, and in battle, fought in the same section of the line. They knew each other's habits and weaknesses and irritating personal quirks with a depth of familiarity that only enforced proximity over years produces. They were not necessarily friends in any warm, chosen sense of the word. You did not choose your contubernium any more than you chose your family. But the bonds that formed within these small groups were real and often extraordinarily strong. The man who stood to your left in the shield wall was not an abstraction. He was the man you knew kept snoring through the night watch and always tried to take the biggest portion of the porridge and complained about the weather with a creativity that had almost become entertainment. He was also the man you would die for and who would die for you in ways that no formal loyalty could quite explain. 10 contubernia, 80 men, formed a century. This is one of those places where Roman military terminology is slightly confusing, because a century sounds like it should contain 100 men, and the name does derive from centum, meaning 100. But the standard Roman century of the imperial period contained 80 soldiers plus their officers. The centurion who commanded it was the most important officer in the practical day-to-day operation of the Roman military. Not generals, not tribunes, centurions. The centurion was, in modern terms, something between a senior sergeant and a junior officer. He was, in most cases, a man who had risen through the ranks, who had started as an ordinary legionary and distinguished himself sufficiently over years of service to be promoted into the officer class. He knew what his men ate for breakfast, and what they were afraid of, and how long they could march before they started making dangerous mistakes from fatigue, because he had done all of it himself. He carried a vine staff, the vites, which was both the symbol of his authority and, according to the sources, sometimes used to apply what we might call motivational physical correction to soldiers who were not performing to his satisfaction. There are complaints about particularly aggressive centurions in the historical record, which suggests this practice was real enough to be worth complaining about, and complaints about centurions survive in sources ranging from Tacitus to personal letters, which is a remarkable range of corroboration. 6 centuries, 480 men formed a cohort. 10 cohorts formed a legion, giving a theoretical strength of roughly 4,800 legionaries, plus officers, plus the various specialists and support staff that any military organization accumulates. The first cohort of a legion was doubled in strength and contained the most experienced and reliable troops, a distinction that carried considerable prestige. There was also the cavalry contingent attached to each legion, roughly 120 horsemen, who served primarily as scouts and dispatch riders rather than as a heavy cavalry force in the sense later European armies would use. At the head of the legion stood the legate, the legatus legionis, who was a senator appointed by the emperor to command the unit. Below him were the tribunes, 6 of them, young men of equestrian rank serving their military obligations, most of them with varying degrees of actual military knowledge and usefulness. There is a tradition among historians of Roman military life of being somewhat gently unkind about the tribunes, and the sources themselves occasionally suggest that the more experienced centurions regarded the fresh-faced tribunes with the kind of patience that very competent professionals extend to enthusiastic amateurs who technically outrank them, which is a dynamic that has never entirely gone away from military life. The real administrative and practical backbone of the Legion lived in its senior non-commissioned officers. The Aquilifer, who carried the Eagle Standard, the most sacred object in the Legion's possession, whose loss in battle was considered a catastrophe of almost religious significance. The Signifer, who carried the Sentry's Standard and also fascinatingly served as the Sentry's banker, handling deposits and accounts for the soldiers under his care. The Optio, the Centurion's second in command, who stood at the back of the sentry in battle formation to encourage men from the rear, a role that could range from inspirational to quite forceful, depending on circumstances. Then there were the Immunes, soldiers who were exempt from certain routine duties because of specialised skills. The Immune category included surveyors, engineers, medical staff, artillerymen, carpenters, blacksmiths, armourers, and a dozen other technical specialists whose particular knowledge was too valuable to waste on latrine-digging detail. Being classified as an immune was a desirable status, not only because it exempted you from the less pleasant routine duties, but because it implied recognition of expertise, a distinction that mattered in a world where status was tracked with careful attention. What all of this structure created at its best was something genuinely remarkable, a sense of belonging that extended beyond the individual contubernium and sentry outward to the entire Legion, was built through shared experience, shared rituals, shared identity. Legions had names and numbers and histories. The Legionarii Hispana, the 9th Spanish Legion, whose mysterious disappearance from the historical record has inspired more novels and films than almost any other Roman military mystery, had its own identity, its own stories, its own pride. Soldiers of the 2nd Legion Augusta felt themselves distinct from soldiers of the 20th Valeria Victrix, and they were correct to feel that way because those distinctions were real and institutionally reinforced. Marcus belonged to his contubernium 1st, his sentry 2nd, his cohort 3rd, and his legion 4th. Each of these concentric circles of belonging shaped his daily experience. They determined who he ate with, and who he trusted, and who he looked to in moments of crisis. They were not simply organisational categories. They were the social architecture of his world, and that world, as we are about to discover, had a very specific physical location. The fort. Home away from home. If you were to somehow appear, magically, at a Roman frontier fort in the early 2nd century CE, the first thing you would notice would probably be the size. Roman forts were not small, improvised affairs. They were permanent, planned, substantial establishments, built to house a unit for potentially decades. The standard auxiliary fort covered somewhere between 2 and 4 hectares, roughly 5 to 10 acres. A full legionary fortress was considerably larger, perhaps 20 to 25 hectares, the size of a small modern town centre. The layout was strikingly consistent. The Romans had developed a standardised fort design, and they applied it with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from having discovered something that works. Walk into any Roman fort in Britain, in Germany, in Syria, in North Africa, and you would find the same basic bones. The playing card shape, rounded corners, straight sides. The 4 gates, one on each cardinal side. The wide road that ran between the main gate and the back gate. The Via Principalis running across the middle. The Via Praetoria from front to headquarters. And at the crossing of these 2 roads, the headquarters building, the Principia, which was the administrative and ceremonial heart of the fort. Inside the Principia was the Eads, the shrine that housed the Legion standards and in many cases the image of the emperor. Soldiers treated this space with something approaching religious reverence, because in a very real sense it was religious. The standards were sacred objects. The eagle of the Legion was not merely a flag. It was a divine presence, a guarantor of the unit's continued existence and supernatural protection. The Principia also housed the administrative offices where the paperwork of the Legion was generated in extraordinary quantities, because the Romans were phenomenal administrators and paperwork was how they kept the whole thing running. Adjacent to the headquarters was the commander's residence, the Praetorium, which was by Roman military standards quite comfortable. By the standards of what the ordinary soldiers lived in, it was practically palatial. There was often an underfloor heating system, the hypocaust, painted walls, a proper kitchen, and space enough for the commander's family. Because officers of sufficient rank brought their families to postings, and the fort was not simply a military establishment but also a small domestic community. The hospital, the valetudinarium, was always present in a properly established fort, and it was more sophisticated than you might expect. Roman military medicine was, by ancient standards, quite advanced, particularly in the areas of wound treatment, surgery, and the management of injury. The Romans had worked out, with that characteristic empirical practicality, that a soldier who died from infection after surviving a battle was a wasted investment. They understood the importance of cleanliness in wound care to a degree that would not be matched in many later European traditions. Military hospitals were organised, staffed by trained medical personnel, and supplied with instruments and medicines. The granaries, the horea, were typically located in a position within the fort where they were protected from fire, which was an ever-present risk in buildings with open flames for heating and cooking. The granaries were built with raised floors allowing air circulation beneath to keep the grain dry and reduce the risk of rot and infestation. They were typically the most structurally sophisticated buildings in the fort after the headquarters, because the Romans understood that an army that runs out of food loses battles in a way that has nothing to do with the enemy. And then there were the barracks. The barracks are where Marcus actually lived, and they deserve some honest description. A standard legionary barrack block was a long, narrow building divided into a series of small rooms. Each contubernium, those 8 men we met earlier, occupied 2 rooms. The outer room, which faced the street, was a storage room for equipment. The inner room was the living space, for 8 men. The inner rooms of a standard Roman barracks measured roughly 3.5 by 4 meters. You can do that calculation yourself and discover that it works out to less than 2 square meters per man, which is less space than a large wardrobe. Now, in fairness, the soldiers were not expected to spend all their time in these rooms. They were out working or drilling or standing guard for most of the day, but when they were in their rooms, they were very much in each other's company, whether they wanted to be or not. The room would have contained the soldiers' personal belongings stored in wooden chests, their sleeping arrangements which range from simple straw mattresses to more elaborate setups, depending on the posting and the period, and whatever personal items a soldier had accumulated over his years of service. Figurines of gods, amulets, a few personal letters, a favourite gambling set. The smell of a Roman barracks would have been, by modern standards, robust. 8 men living in a very small space, doing physically demanding work, in an era before deodorant or daily bathing, eating a diet heavy in preserved and fermented foods. The Romans did bathe, and the bathhouse, the thermae or balneum, was a standard feature of any established fort. But they bathed when they could get to the bathhouse, which was not necessarily every day. The practical odour of a barrack room was simply part of life. Outside the official buildings of the fort, life had its own geography. Beyond the walls, the area around many established forts saw the gradual growth of a civilian settlement. The vicus, where traders, craftspeople, tavern keepers, the families of soldiers, and a whole community of people who made their living serving the military gathered. These vici could range from small clusters of buildings to substantial settlements, with their own temples, market buildings, and civic character. They were an organic outgrowth of the fort's presence, the civilian world pressing up against the military one, and they reveal something important about the Roman military. It was never quite as sealed off from the rest of life as its formal structure implied. Marcus, walking through his fort on a typical morning, would have experienced all of this. The familiar smell of the barracks, the sounds of the fort coming to life, the sight of the headquarters building with its standards visible through the open doors, the smell of bread from the granary stores and the sound of the bathhouse furnace being stoked. This was home. Not in the way that the house he grew up in was home, but in the way that any place becomes home when you have lived in it long enough and it has shaped you sufficiently. Let us start the day. Before dawn, rising in the dark, the Roman night was divided into 4 watches, the vigiliae each lasting roughly 3 hours. The first watch began at sunset. The 4th watch ended at sunrise. This division of the night into 4 roughly equal periods was not arbitrary. It was functional. It meant that the burden of night sentry duty could be distributed across multiple groups of soldiers, with each group bearing 1 watch's worth of responsibility before being relieved. In theory, this gave most soldiers most of the night for sleep. In practice, military life has a remarkable talent for finding additional things to do with whatever time a soldier thought he had for himself. The 4th watch, the last watch before dawn, was the watch that ended as the sky began to pale. It was also the watch associated with the morning call, the signal that began the military day in earnest. Different Roman forts used different signals, horns, tubas, bucinas, These were the instruments that organised the sonic landscape of the military camp, each call meaning something specific and carrying that meaning across the entire fort to anyone within earshot. Marcus, assuming he was not actually on the fourth watch himself, was woken by sound rather than by any internal alarm. The morning call would have drifted through the thin walls of the barracks into the small room where he and his contubernum slept. If he was lucky, he had had a full night, or something approaching it. If he had pulled a night watch earlier, he was working on whatever sleep he had managed to grab before and after his stint on the wall. Getting up in a Roman barracks before dawn in the 1st century CE was a physical experience of a particular quality. The room would have been cold, because Roman heating systems, while impressive by ancient standards, did not generally extend into the soldiers' sleeping quarters. The stone floors and walls held the chill of the night. Marcus's breath would have been visible in the air. He would have reached probably before opening his eyes entirely for the layers he had shed before sleeping. The military tunic, the woolen undergarments, and if the posting was somewhere cold, Britain or the Rhine frontier or the Danube provinces, the additional layers that soldiers accumulated through individual initiative, because the official kit was not always adequate to the actual weather conditions of the posting. We know actually quite specifically about Roman soldiers and their relationship with cold, because one of the most remarkable archives of ancient personal writing comes from the garrison at Vindolanda, a fort just south of Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain. The Vindolanda tablets, thin slivers of wood with writing scratched into them, preserve the actual letters and records of the garrison stationed there around the late 1st and early 2nd century CE. Among these tablets are requests from soldiers to family members and contacts, asking for specific items to be sent. Warm socks appear in these requests. Underpants appear in these requests. Cloaks appear. A soldier writing from what is now northern England 2,000 years ago, asking someone to please send him warm socks, is a moment of human continuity so vivid it can make you slightly emotional if you think about it for too long. Or maybe that is just me. The morning routine began before there was enough light to do anything comfortably. Personal hygiene was conducted as efficiently as the available facilities permitted. The fort's latrines were communal, a row of seats over a channel of running water, which the Romans had understood was a significantly more sanitary arrangement than alternatives. Roman latrines were social spaces, in the sense that soldiers used them together and apparently conversed there without any particular discomfort, which tells you something about the difference between Roman and modern notions of personal privacy. There was a shared sponge on a stick for post-use cleaning, which is one of those details of Roman life that historians always feel obliged to mention, and which modern audiences always have roughly the same reaction to. Before any of the formal duties of the day began, Marcus would have made some acknowledgement of his religious obligations. For the Roman soldier, religion was not a private, individual matter separate from public and military life. It was woven into the fabric of the institution. The military calendar was dense with religious observances, festivals, and required sacrifices, which we will explore in much more detail in the chapter on religion. But even on an ordinary morning with no particular festival scheduled, a soldier might briefly honour whatever deity he felt closest to. A small prayer, a touch of a personal amulet, a momentary turn toward whatever direction was sacred for his particular religious preference. The Roman military world was religiously plural, in a way that modern readers sometimes find surprising. Soldiers worshipped the official Roman gods, the emperor's genius, the standards themselves, and also any number of other deities that came with them from their home provinces or that they had picked up along the way. Then food, and the morning meal of a Roman soldier deserves its own moment of attention. The morning was typically the lightest meal of the day, something quick and simple. Bread, which was the absolute foundation of the Roman military diet, sometimes eaten with olive oil or salt, or a scraping of whatever preserved food was available. Occasionally olives or cheese. The Roman military maintained that the majority of a soldier's calories came from grain, specifically wheat, and this was not a matter of preference, but of logistics. Grain was dense, storable, portable, and could be turned into bread or porridge or any number of other sustaining preparations. The daily grain ration for a Roman soldier was around 1 kilogram, which provided something in the range of 3,000 calories, the minimum a man doing hard physical labour in all weathers actually needs. The morning was also when, if a soldier had drawn barley rations rather than wheat, he would have something to say about it. Barley rations were considered a punishment ration, assigned to units or individuals who had distinguished themselves through failure or cowardice. The social stigma of the barley ration was as significant as the dietary one. It was public. Everyone knew who was eating barley. It was a calculated humiliation, and it worked. As the light grew, the fort came properly to life. The sounds shifted from the quiet noises of individuals dressing and eating to the collective sounds of an institution beginning its formal day. Voices, footsteps on the stone streets between the barrack blocks, the distant clink of equipment being picked up, and then the sound that organised all of it, the horn calling the assembly, morning duties, drill, inspection, and the business of the day. The morning assembly was the formal beginning of the military day, the moment when the Legion organised itself into its proper shape, and the machinery of the institution came visibly to life. At the sound of the call, soldiers from across the fort moved to their assembly points century by century, falling into their positions in the formations that they practised, often enough to execute in the semi-dark with their eyes still somewhat reluctant to fully open. Roll call was taken. The Romans were meticulous record keepers, and the morning roll call was no exception. Each century maintained detailed records of the whereabouts and condition of its men, accounting for those on duty, those in the hospital, those on detached service elsewhere, those with the various administrative exemptions that kept a proportion of any military unit doing something other than standing in the parade ground at dawn. The Roman legions generated paperwork at a rate that would not feel entirely foreign to a modern military administrator, and much of that paperwork was generated from the daily accounting of who was present and what they were doing. After the roll, inspection. The Romans were serious about the state of their equipment, and for reasons that were entirely practical rather than merely aesthetic. A soldier whose shield is not properly maintained is a soldier whose shield fails at the worst possible moment. A soldier whose sword is not kept sharp is a soldier who strikes with less effect when effect is most needed. A soldier whose armour has corroded weak points is a soldier who is less protected than his officer believes him to be, which is a problem that manifests in a particular and final way in battle. The inspection of equipment was therefore not petty officiousness, it was rational risk management expressed through military discipline. The centurion, or his optio acting on his behalf, would move through the assembled sentry examining shields, swords, daggers, body armour, helmets, and the various additional items of kit that each soldier was responsible for maintaining. Finding a man with a deteriorating piece of equipment was not a neutral event. It was an opportunity for correction, and Roman centurions tended to embrace such opportunities with enthusiasm. The vine staff was not simply a symbol. After inspection came the assignment of duties for the day. The Romans actually documented this process, and we have surviving examples of what are called duty rosters from Roman military papyri found in Egypt. These are actual lists written on actual papyrus, of which soldiers were assigned to which tasks on which days. They are among the most direct windows we have into the ordinary texture of Roman military life, and they reveal a world of considerable bureaucratic organisation. On any given day, a substantial proportion of a legion's soldiers would be assigned to duties other than drilling or guard: roadwork, construction, escorting supply convoys, operating the fort's administrative machinery, working in the granaries, serving as bathhouse attendants, assigned to the hospital, engaged in any of dozens of specialised tasks that kept the military installation functioning. Those soldiers not assigned to specialised duties spent the morning drilling, and this, for the Roman legionary, was a recurring and non-negotiable feature of military life, regardless of how experienced he was or how long he had been in the legion. The Romans drilled their soldiers with a consistency that bordered on obsession, and they had a clear theory about why this mattered. It was articulated most explicitly by the later Roman military writer Vegetius, who wrote in the late Empire period but drew on earlier practices in his work Epitome Rei Militaris, which is essentially a manual of Roman military theory. Vegetius wrote that an army is strong in proportion to the training of its soldiers. The soldier who has not been thoroughly drilled is not a soldier in any meaningful sense. He is simply a man with a weapon, which is considerably less useful. The morning drill covered a range of exercises: formation practice, moving the sentry through its various tactical configurations with the kind of smooth precision that only comes from repetition; weapons exercises, working through the standard movements of thrust and block, and the use of the shield as an offensive weapon, because the Romans understood that the shield boss, the heavy metal dome in the centre of the scutum, was as useful for striking an opponent in the face as it was for blocking his attacks. Long-distance running and route marching maintained the baseline physical fitness that the campaigns and border patrols required. Javelin throwing practice, because the pilum, the heavy Roman javelin that was thrown immediately before close combat, was a critical weapon that required specific skill to use effectively. The pilum was a piece of military engineering as characteristic of Roman warfare as the short sword, the gladius. It was designed not merely to wound, but to disable. The iron shank of the pilum was engineered to bend on impact, whether it hit a man or a shield. If it hit a shield, it bent and hung from the shield, making the shield extremely heavy and difficult to manage. This forced the enemy either to drop the shield or to fight while dragging a heavy dangling javelin, both of which were bad options. The Romans had invented a military weapon specifically designed to make the enemy's defensive equipment a liability. This is the kind of thinking that built an empire. Drill also served a function beyond the purely technical. It built the collective body memory that made the Roman military formation so effective. In battle, there is no time to think about where to put your feet or how to hold your shield, or when to push and when to step back. These things have to be automatic, as involuntary as breathing, because the conscious mind in a real battle is occupied with a dozen other things, including the rather pressing question of whether it is going to survive the next 60 seconds. Drill built the automaticity, the same movements practiced thousands of times until they required no thought, only reflex. This was the Roman secret, if it can even be called a secret, since they wrote about it quite openly. They won battles not because their soldiers were braver or stronger than their opponents, but because their soldiers were more thoroughly trained to act as a coordinated unit regardless of what was happening around them. Between the formal drill sessions, the morning's work also involved the endless maintenance tasks that kept a soldier's equipment functional. Oiling leather straps, working metal to keep it free of rust, replacing worn or broken components. A soldier's kit was simultaneously his responsibility and his lifeline, and caring for it was not considered optional. By the time the morning's formal duties concluded, the sun would be well up, the fort would be in full operation, and Marcus would be thoroughly awake in the way that sustained physical activity produces, a kind of alert tiredness where the body is warmed and working, but the awareness of accumulated fatigue sits underneath everything, waiting. Then came the work of the afternoon, or more specifically the work of empire, the work of war, building, digging and marching. Here is something that the movies never quite get right about Roman soldiers, and I'm going to take a brief moment to be slightly triumphant about this, because it is one of my favourite misconceptions to correct. The Roman soldier spent considerably more of his career building things than he did fighting people. This is not a minor footnote. It is perhaps the defining characteristic of the Roman military enterprise that distinguishes it most sharply from the popular imagination. The Roman legion was, among other things, an engineering corps of extraordinary capability, and the military training that produced a fighting man also produced a man who could survey a road, calculate a load-bearing arch, construct a bridge in 3 days, and dig a defensive ditch to precise specifications that had been standardized centuries before he was born. The road-building work of the Roman legions is the most visible legacy of the military in the modern world. Roman roads are still walked today. Their lines are still followed by modern roads in Britain, in France, in Italy, in the Middle East, in North Africa. The famous Roman straightness of roads, which was the result of Roman surveying technique using a groma, an instrument for establishing straight lines and right angles, is so deeply embedded in the landscape of Europe that satellite imagery can still detect the ghost lines of Roman roads through the patterns of field boundaries and hedgerows that grew up around them in subsequent centuries. Building these roads was not a light undertaking. A proper Roman road required significant preparation. First, the route was surveyed and marked out. Then the topsoil was excavated to a depth that varied depending on local conditions, but was typically substantial. The roadbed was then built up in layers, a foundation of large stones, a middle layer of smaller rubble and gravel, a binding layer of finer material, and a top surface of carefully laid stones or packed gravel, with the whole thing slightly cambered, higher in the middle than at the edges so that rainwater would run off to the sides. Drainage ditches were typically cut on both sides of the road to carry that water away. The whole structure was built to last, and the evidence suggests it did. Soldiers did this work. Not all of it, because the Romans also made extensive use of local labour, sometimes conscripted and sometimes contracted, and of specialised civilian contractors for certain aspects of construction. But the military presence in road-building projects was substantial and systematic. When a legion needed roads in its operational area, it built them. The soldiers were the engineers and the labourers, and they did not generally seem to have regarded this as an insult to their military dignity, possibly because the connection between the roads they built and the tactical advantage those roads provided was entirely obvious. Bridge building was perhaps the most spectacular engineering achievement of the Roman military. Caesar's description in his own account of his campaigns, the Gallic Wars, of building a timber bridge across the Rhine in approximately 10 days, which he then used to make a demonstration of Roman power to the Germanic tribes, cross the river, do some burning of villages to make a point, and then cross back again before anyone could organise a response, is one of the more extraordinary passages of ancient military writing. Not for the fighting, because there was not much of it, but for the sheer confidence of the engineering achievement. 10 days to build a bridge across a major European river, using military manpower as a casual demonstration. Fort and camp construction was the other great expression of Roman military engineering. We have already seen what a permanent fort looked like, but the Romans also built temporary marching camps, constructed at the end of each day's march, which followed the same standardized layout in miniature. The construction of a marching camp was a routine military skill that every soldier was expected to contribute to. It began with survey and layout, the same groma work that went into roads, establishing the boundaries and internal organization of the camp. Then came the digging of the defensive ditch, a V-shaped or U-shaped trench that ran around the perimeter. The earth from the ditch was thrown up to form a rampart, into the top of which sharpened stakes were driven, stakes that each soldier carried as part of his march kit, which is another one of those details that helps explain why the marching pack was so heavy. A legionary marching at the standard pace of around 3 miles per hour, covering 18 to 20 miles in a standard day's march, arrived at the campsite already carrying the weight of full equipment, plus his personal kit, plus the stakes, plus several days' rations. He was expected, without being given the opportunity to rest first, to help build the camp before he could eat or sleep. This was not cruelty for its own sake. The camp was the soldier's protection for the night, and an army that skipped the camp-building step was an army vulnerable to a night attack. The discipline that built the camp before dinner was the discipline that kept men alive. The Roman march itself deserves extended attention because it was, in many ways, the fundamental expression of Roman military power. The speed and distances that Roman armies covered on the march astonished their contemporaries and still command respect. Caesar's legions during the Gallic campaigns moved at a pace that sometimes left even his allied cavalry struggling to keep up. The standard rate was around 18 to 20 Roman miles per day in a regular march, but forced marches could push this to 35 or even 40 miles, though this was demanding enough that it could only be sustained for short periods before the physical cost became prohibitive. The key to Roman marching speed was not some special physical quality of Roman soldiers, it was organization. The logistics that kept the army fed and supplied, the roads that provided reliable surfaces, the accumulated training that had made the march automatic rather than effortful, and the culture within the legions that treated the ability to march fast and far as a point of pride rather than a complaint. Soldiers competed to carry their packs with ease. They had nicknames for the equipment, calling themselves Marius's mules after the general Gaius Marius, who had reformed the legions in the late Republic, and had, among other things, increased the amount of equipment that each soldier was expected to carry personally rather than having it transported by the baggage train. The marching discipline that the Romans demanded was physical, but it was also social. A column of soldiers marching badly, straggling, breaking formation, losing pace, was a column that consumed itself in wasted motion and created vulnerability. A column marching well was a different organism entirely, a coordinated body moving through the landscape with the efficiency of a machine, leaving behind it roads and bridges and camps, arriving at its destination capable of fighting. The Roman army at the march was Rome's power expressed in motion, and the ordinary soldier was both the mechanism and the expression of that power. After a day of building or marching or digging, the physical exhaustion was real and significant. Marcus, returning to the fort after a work party or a patrol, was not performing a romantic historical drama. He was a working man who had done hard physical labour in whatever the local weather had chosen to throw at him, and he wanted his dinner and his bunk in roughly that order. Midday, rest, food, and a moment to breathe. The middle of a Roman soldier's day arrived not with ceremony but with relief. A horn call, a brief reorganisation of whatever work was underway, and the institutional machinery of the legion paused to do the one thing that no amount of military discipline could make optional: eat. The Romans were not sentimental about this. They did not frame the midday pause as a reward or a luxury. They framed it as a logistical necessity, which is exactly what it was. Men doing hard physical labour in all weathers require calories at regular intervals, and a military organisation that forgets this fact discovers the consequences in reduced performance, increased error, and the particular and dangerous kind of exhaustion that sets in when a working body has burned through whatever it was given at dawn and received nothing to replace it. So the midday stop was consistent, predictable, and relatively brief. It was not a long afternoon siesta in any Mediterranean civilian sense. It was a practical pause in the working day, long enough to eat and to rest the legs and to have a conversation that was not about the work, and short enough that the centurion did not have to feel that he was being indulgent. The meal itself, for soldiers who were out on work parties or patrol, was carried with them rather than prepared back at the fort. This was another expression of the Roman military's commitment to practical thinking over comfortable thinking. A work party that has to return to the fort for its midday meal is a work party that loses an hour or more to travel, and an hour of working time in the Roman military was not considered a small thing. So soldiers carried their rations with them, in the leather satchels that were part of standard kit, and they ate wherever they happened to be when the sun reached its highest point. The contents of that midday ration were simple to the point of austerity, though after enough years of military service the soldiers tended to stop noticing. Hard bread, which is perhaps the most honest description of military bread at the stage of the day when it had been carried in a pack for several hours. Some hard cheese, pressed and dried to survive the conditions of transport in a way that fresh cheese very obviously could not. Olives, when the supply chain had been cooperative, which it was not always. Dried fruit of various kinds, figs or dates, depending on what part of the empire the supply was coming from, and what the current state of the procurement contracts looked like. A portion of whatever preserved meat or dried fish was in the current ration cycle. And to wash all of this down, what the Roman military considered its standard hydration solution. Here I need to stop and be honest with you about something, because this is one of those historical details that I genuinely enjoy sharing, and that always produces a particular response in modern audiences. The standard drink of the Roman soldier was posca. Posca was vinegar diluted with water. That is it. That is the whole recipe. Vinegar, water, mixed together, carried in a leather container, consumed throughout the day, including at midday when the leather container had been sitting in the sun for several hours, and the contents had developed, let us say, character. I would like to acknowledge, clearly and without reservation, that this sounds absolutely terrible. Warm, vinegary water in a container that smells of the leather it was made from, carried by a man who has been marching since before dawn. The experience of drinking it must have been, at minimum, bracing. And yet the Romans drank it. Legionaries drank it. Emperors on campaign drank it. The historical sources describe it as a normal feature of daily life across wide sections of Roman society, not just the military. The reason there was a reason, and the reason was sensible enough once you step back from the flavour. Vinegar is acidic, and acidity kills a meaningful proportion of the bacteria that make untreated water dangerous. In a world before water treatment and before the germ theory of disease, before anyone had the theoretical framework to explain why certain water sources made people violently ill and others did not, the Romans had arrived empirically at a preparation that made their water safer than untreated alternatives. They did not know why it worked. They knew that it worked, in the sense that armies that drank it seemed to get sick less often than armies that did not. The Roman military, with its characteristic preference for things that demonstrably produced results over things that merely seemed logical, kept the posca. There is also, for context, the remarkable and slightly sobering fact that posca appears in the account of the crucifixion, offered to Christ on the cross on a sponge. This tells you something about the reach of the practice. When posca appears as a detail in the most documented execution in the ancient world, you understand that it was not a niche military quirk. It was simply what people drank. The Romans had normalized the thing, which is perhaps the most Roman possible response to a dietary necessity that anyone with taste buds would otherwise object to. Wine was also part of the military diet, and I want to be precise about this because the popular image of Roman soldiers drinking heroically and continuously is not really supported by the evidence of how the military actually managed alcohol. Wine was issued. Daily rations of wine were a genuine part of the military provisioning system, and soldiers received them as a matter of course. But the quantities were modest, and they were expected to be diluted with water in the standard Roman fashion, which reduced the alcohol content considerably from what the modern imagination conjures. The Romans had a culturally specific contempt for drinking wine undiluted, which they associated with uncivilized peoples who did not know better. A soldier who turned up to his duties in a state of actual intoxication was not displaying Roman virtue. He was making a disciplinary problem for his centurion. This does not mean soldiers never drank to excess. Of course they did. There is ample evidence in the historical and archaeological record of the Roman military world that recreational drinking happened, that taverns in the vicus outside the fort did reasonable business in the evenings, and that commanders occasionally had to deal with the consequences of that business in the morning. But the institution itself, the formal military structure, was organized around the expectation of reliable, consistent, sober performance, and the alcohol policy reflected that expectation, rather than the reality that sometimes departed from it. What the midday break gave soldiers that nothing else in the day quite managed was permission to be relatively human for a short while. Rank existed at midday, because rank in the Roman military never entirely disappeared, but the formality of the morning assembly and the focused purposefulness of the work party both eased slightly when the food came out. Men who had been detailed to different tasks since dawn ended up in the same spot for the meal, and that proximity produced conversation that was not about the work. Roman soldiers, it is worth establishing clearly, had a great deal to say. The surviving written evidence, the letters and the administrative records, and the occasional more literary document that preserves something of the internal life of the military community makes it consistently clear that the Roman legionary was not a passive vessel for orders. He had opinions. He had views on his equipment and whether it was adequate, on his centurion and whether he was fair, on the food and whether it was acceptable, on the current posting and how it compared to previous ones, on the broader direction of Roman military policy as it affected his specific daily existence. The Roman soldier's capacity for informed, articulate complaint is one of the most well-documented features of his character, running from the letters preserved at Vindolanda through the mutiny accounts in Tacitus, each of which begins with soldiers raising specific, often entirely legitimate grievances about their conditions of service. This tradition of complaint was tolerated within limits, because the limits mattered enormously. There was a distance, sometimes a fine one, between legitimate grumbling, which was essentially a social pressure valve that the military quietly permitted, and actual insubordination, which was treated with a severity that concentrated the mind. Every centurion managed this line in his own way, developing over time a calibrated sense of when the complaints were the normal noise of men doing a hard job, and when they were becoming something that required active intervention. Getting that calibration wrong in either direction, suppressing legitimate grievance too hard or allowing actual challenge to authority to develop, was a failure of command. At midday, the complaints tended toward the benign. The bread was hard. Someone's share of the cheese was smaller than someone else's. The work assignment for the afternoon was unfair relative to what the 3rd century drew yesterday. These were not political statements. They were the natural conversational byproduct of 8 or more men who spent all their time together, ate together, worked together, and had long since run out of topics that were entirely neutral. Gambling also happened at midday, when time permitted. The Romans had a relationship with gambling that went beyond casual entertainment into something more like a deep cultural commitment. Dice sets show up in the archaeological record of Roman military sites with remarkable consistency. Small bone or ivory or clay objects that were clearly personal possessions carried by individual soldiers rather than communal equipment. Games were scratched into stone pavements and wooden surfaces wherever soldiers spent time with nothing formally required of them. The patterns of worn stone at fort gateways and bathhouses show the marks of gaming boards carved by men waiting for something to happen, filling the time with the universal human solution of play. Duodecim scripta, the 12 lines game, was a backgammon ancestor that appears in both literary references and physical traces. Knucklebones, using the actual ankle bones of sheep or goats, was played across every social level and every military posting in the Roman world. The gambling element was consistent. Where there were games, there were wagers. Where there were wagers, there were winners and losers. Where there were winners and losers, there were the social dynamics of money changing hands among men who were already in each other's company for 24 hours a day, which produced both the friction and the release that any community of people confined together requires. The military administration was presumably aware of all this. The silence of the official sources on the subject of routine gambling during off-duty hours suggests that it was simply accepted as a feature of soldier life, rather than a problem requiring active suppression. Individual commanders varied in how strictly they interpreted the bounds of permitted recreation, and some were clearly more interested than others in regulating what their soldiers did with their free time. but the broader institutional posture seems to have been one of practical tolerance for activities that occupied men productively, without creating real disorder. Then there were the letters. On days when the midday break was long enough, or in the evenings that the midday break allowed a soldier to anticipate, he might use some of the available time composing correspondence. Literate soldiers wrote themselves, scratching words onto wooden tablets or papyrus with a stylus or a reed pen, working through the specific intimate difficulties of long-distance communication with patients. Soldiers who were not fully literate engaged the services of better-educated colleagues, or in towns near the fort. Professional scribes who wrote letters for a small fee, and who must have heard every possible variation of every possible message across the years of their practice. The letters that survive from Roman military sites reveal the full range of what a person separated from home thinks about and needs to say. There are the practical requests, specific and carefully specified: send money, send clothing, send medicine of a particular kind that is not available at the posting. There are the health reports, confirming that the writer is well, asking after the health of the recipient with a specificity that implies ongoing concern rather than mere formality. There are the expressions of affection, sometimes formal and sometimes catching a more personal note in the phrasing, the moment where the scribe's standard formulas give way to something the sender actually meant in their own voice. There are complaints about the gap between letters received, the particular anxiety of waiting for news across a distance that measured itself in weeks rather than days. One of the most famous pieces of writing from Vindolanda is a birthday invitation from Claudia Severa to Sulpicia Lepidina, a woman inviting her friend to come and celebrate with her. Formal in its opening, careful in its phrasing, and then, near the end, a few words in a different hand, the writer herself taking the pen from the scribe to add something personal. The warmth in those few words is immediate and entirely without mediation. A person reaching across 2,000 years of silence to make contact. Two women, on the edge of the Roman world, maintaining friendship across the distance that military life imposed. That story, of people trying to stay connected across impossible distances, is not a Roman story specifically. It is as old as the first time a human being left somewhere they loved for somewhere they had to be. The Roman soldiers at their midday rest, eating their hard bread and their questionable cheese and their not quite wine, writing their letters or thinking about what they meant to write, were living the same story that people live when they are a long way from home and doing their best to maintain the ties that make the distance bearable. The horn sounded again. The afternoon's work was waiting, and the midday pause, never quite long enough regardless of its actual duration, folded itself back into the machinery of the day. Afternoon duties, guard patrol and the watchful empire if. The morning belonged to drilling and building, the afternoon had a different character. It was the time of the legion surveillance function, the hours when the watchful apparatus of empire was most visible in the daily rotation of guard and patrol duties. Guard duty was a permanent feature of Roman military life. The gates of the fort required guarding at all times. The walls required watching. The headquarters, the granaries, the commander's residence, the hospital, the armory, all required some form of security presence. The guard roster moved through the centuries in rotation, meaning that any given soldier could expect to pull guard duty every few days. It was not an exciting assignment. It was not supposed to be exciting. It was supposed to be predictable, reliable, and consistent, which are the qualities that security functions require. The Roman guard system was organized around the same watch structure that divided the night, with passwords assigned and changed at each watch handover. We actually have examples of Roman military passwords preserved in historical sources, and some of them are magnificent in their specificity. The password was issued at headquarters and communicated down through the chain of command to every man on guard duty. If a soldier on duty could not correctly produce the day's password, that was a problem. If the password was not correctly challenged by the soldier you expected to be on guard, that was a considerably larger problem. The punishment for sleeping on guard duty was by modern standards severe. Roman military law prescribed death for this offence in certain circumstances, and there are accounts of executions carried out for it during campaigns, though in garrison life the punishment was more likely to be corporal or financial. The severity of the rule reflected the severity of the risk. A sleeping sentry was a gap in the security net through which disaster could enter without warning. The Romans were not wrong about this. Beyond the fort's walls, the afternoon was when patrols went out into the surrounding territory. The nature of these patrols varied enormously depending on where the fort was located, and what the current state of relations with the surrounding population looked like. A fort deep in a thoroughly pacified province in the interior of Gaul, or along the well-established roads of Italy, might send out patrols that were more administrative than military in character, soldiers whose job was to maintain visibility and connection with the local communities, to manage petty disputes, to escort official travellers, to report on anything unusual. A fort on the active frontier was a different story. Frontier life occupied a psychological space that is difficult to convey in purely descriptive terms, because the experience was dominated not by the dramatic moments of violence, but by the grinding, extended experience of alert uncertainty. On the Rhine frontier or the Danube frontier, or in the hills of northern Britain or the deserts of the eastern provinces, the soldier on patrol was moving through territory that was partly familiar and partly not, where the people he encountered might be allied, neutral, or hostile, and where the distinction between those three categories was not always immediately obvious. The Germanic tribes across the Rhine were not a monolithic enemy. Some groups were friendly to Rome, some hostile, some shifting between those positions depending on the latest political developments on both sides of the river. Roman diplomacy worked constantly, through gift-giving and hostage-taking and the cultivation of pro-Roman leaders within the tribes, to maintain as much stability as possible. Roman soldiers were part of this diplomatic apparatus whether they thought of themselves that way or not. Their patrols sent a message: Rome is watching, Rome is present. The cost of changing sides or launching a raid is not worth whatever you think you would gain. The psychological experience of frontier patrol was shaped by boredom, punctuated by moments of acute anxiety, which is a pattern familiar to soldiers from every era. The long stretches when nothing happened were not relaxing. They were a kind of sustained alertness that was itself exhausting. Every tree line was a potential ambush. Every unfamiliar face was an unknown quantity. The sensory attunement required to move safely through uncertain territory was constant, and the maintenance of that attunement over hours and days and weeks and months was genuinely wearing. There were also raids. Even in relatively stable periods, the frontier was never entirely quiet. Small parties of men might cross from the other side to steal livestock or grain, to settle personal grievances, to test Roman response times. The Roman military tracked these incidents with the record-keeping thoroughness that characterized all its administrative activities. Losses of livestock and property were reported. The response to the raid was organized and conducted through proper channels. The underlying logic was that the frontier must be maintained as a permeable membrane of controlled contact rather than a sealed barrier, because a sealed barrier was impossible over such distances, but the permeability had to be managed on Roman terms. The soldier on afternoon patrol was the human presence that made this management real. He was not a symbol or an abstraction. He was a specific man in specific territory, with specific knowledge of the local geography and local social dynamics, making specific daily decisions about how to handle what he encountered. This required judgment as much as strength, and the Roman military, whatever its reputation for rigid discipline, actually cultivated judgment in its soldiers to a considerable degree. The afternoon patrol typically returned to the fort before evening, reporting to the duty officer and contributing its observations to the ongoing intelligence picture that the fort's commanders maintained. The intelligence function of Roman military patrols was as significant as the security function. Knowing what was happening beyond the wall, knowing which chieftains were growing ambitious or restless, knowing where population movements were occurring, knowing the current state of harvests and supplies in the territory beyond the frontier, all of this fed into the Roman military's understanding of its operational environment. Then the afternoon drew toward evening, and with it came the particular quality of light that every frontier soldier in every century has watched move across the landscape outside the walls. The end of the working day, in theory. In practice, the beginning of the evening's obligations. Battle. When the day turned violent. I need to be honest with you about something before we get into this chapter. Most days in a Roman soldier's career did not include a battle. Most years in a Roman soldier's career did not include a battle. The actual experience of combat was rarer than the military institution surrounding it might suggest, and a soldier could serve 25 years with the legions and see relatively little of it, depending on where he was posted and when. But battles happened, and when they did, they were the most defining experience of a soldier's life, the thing that everything else was preparation for, the moment when all the drilling and the physical conditioning and the weapons training and the formation practice collapsed into actual violence with actual consequences. So we're going to spend some time here, because the Roman soldier's experience of battle is one of the most distinctive things about him, and it deserves honest treatment, The approach to battle was, in itself, a particular kind of experience. Roman armies did not generally rush headlong into combat from a standing start. There was typically a period of manoeuvring, of positioning, of the assessment that both sides engaged in as they approached the moment of actual engagement. During this period, the sounds of the approaching battle were already present. The drums and horns of the Roman military signalling system, the shouting of officers, the collective noise of thousands of men moving in armour, and below all of that, barely audible in the general sound but felt as a kind of pressure in the chest, the noise from the other side. The enemy's battle noise was one of the elements of Roman combat experience that the sources describe with some regularity. Many of the peoples Rome fought used sound as a deliberate psychological weapon. The Celtic warrior tradition, shared across much of Gaul and Britain and the Germanic frontier, involved large war horns called carnixes, which produced a brassy, discordant sound designed to intimidate. There was also the collective shouting of men working themselves up to the moment of violence. The battle cry that served both to terrify the opposition and to suppress the individual soldier's entirely rational fear response through the physical experience of making noise. Roman soldiers were trained specifically not to respond to this. The discipline of the formation required that each man maintain his position, his shield up, his body angled correctly, his weapon ready, regardless of what the noise from the other side was doing to his nervous system. This sounds simpler than it was. Every human instinct in the moment before violence either pushes toward flight or toward a kind of individual aggressive response that breaks formation. The entire project of Roman military training was the suppression of both of those instincts and their replacement with a third option, standing firm as part of the collective organism of the formation. At a certain point in the approach, the Roman formation would halt and the first act of Roman battle would begin, the pilum throw. Each legionary carried 2 pila, and they were thrown at relatively close range, perhaps 20 to 30 metres, just before the collision of the two formations. The effect of a volley of pila from a Roman sentry was significant. The psychological impact of 1,000 heavy javelins arriving simultaneously was considerable. The physical impact was more targeted but potentially devastating, and the strategic impact, those pila bending in shields and rendering them unwieldy, was precisely what the weapon was designed to achieve. Then the formations collided, and here is where the Roman military system expressed its fullest genius. The Roman close combat style was not a matter of individual sword fighting in any romantic sense. It was a collective enterprise, a matter of the formation maintaining its integrity, while each individual soldier within it did his specific job. The legionary's job in close combat was narrow and specific. He used his shield to press against the man in front of him, using the mass of the formation to push the enemy formation back or keep it stationary. From behind the shield he worked his short sword, the gladius, in short, precise thrusting movements at whatever gaps and openings presented themselves in the enemy's defences. The gladius was a weapon designed for this style of fighting, with a broad blade of good length for thrusting, and a guard that protected the hand. It was not a slashing weapon in the primary sense, though it could be used that way. It was an instrument of controlled, methodical violence in close quarters. The physical experience of the Roman shield wall was intense in ways that are difficult to convey. The men were in extremely close physical contact with both enemies and their own comrades. The noise was enormous. The crash of weapon on shield, the shouting of officers and soldiers, the sound of men in pain. The smell, and this is something the sources rarely address directly but which was absolutely real, was of blood and sweat and fear in close proximity. The ground underfoot became unreliable as the soil churned and the detritus of combat accumulated. In this environment, the individual soldier's job was to keep doing his specific task despite everything his nervous system was telling him. The formation depended on every man doing his part. A gap in the shield wall was a crisis. A man who broke and ran created a gap. The soldiers around him had to maintain their positions even as the gap opened, which made them individually more vulnerable while they closed it. This is why Roman military culture treated running from battle with such severity. It was not merely cowardice in the moral sense. It was a threat to the entire system. The Roman formation was also designed to rotate its frontline fighters in a way that managed the physical demands of close combat. Roman close combat was extraordinarily exhausting, and a man fighting at the front of the formation could only sustain full intensity for a relatively short period before fatigue became dangerous. The rotation system, where rear-rank soldiers periodically moved up to replace front-rank men who had been fighting for longer, extended the formation's effectiveness and managed the human cost of sustained combat. It required a level of organisation under pressure that only extensive drilling could produce. After a battle, assuming Marcus was among the survivors, came the aftermath. And the aftermath of ancient battle was not the clean, quick resolution that dramatic narratives sometimes imply. The wounded needed to be collected and treated, and Roman military medicine, as we have noted, was capable enough to save some of the men who might have died without it. The dead needed to be identified and, where possible, cremated or buried with appropriate religious observances. The enemy's dead and wounded presented their own set of questions about captives and treatment, and the logistics of dealing with a battlefield. The emotional aftermath of battle is harder to document but no less real. We have occasional references in the sources to the way soldiers responded to combat, and these references reveal a range of responses from exhilaration to exhaustion to something that we might recognize as the more troubled processing of extreme experience. The Roman military did not have a developed vocabulary for what we would now call post-traumatic stress, but there is evidence in the sources of behaviors that could be interpreted through that lens. Withdrawal, changes in character, reluctance to discuss certain experiences. The Romans were not emotionally different from modern humans. They simply had different frameworks for making sense of what they felt. The night after a battle, assuming the tactical situation permitted the army to make camp, was quiet in a different way from ordinary nights. The camp was alive with the sounds of the wounded being treated and the administrative work of accounting for losses, but over all of it was a particular quality of exhausted relief, the specific emotional texture of having survived something that was not certain to be survivable. Marcus, lying in his tent or his bunk, would have known the names of the men who were not there, the contubernium -1 or 2, the century with gaps in it. This was the cost of the day, expressed in the most personal terms possible, the soldier's inner world, religion, superstition, and the gods. The Roman soldier did not live in a secular world. This is perhaps the single most important thing to understand about his inner life, and it is the thing that most sharply separates his experience from that of a modern soldier in a modern army. When we use the word religion today, we tend to mean something relatively compartmentalized. A set of beliefs held privately, practiced at designated times in designated places, kept reasonably separate from the practical business of daily life. The Roman soldier would have found this arrangement genuinely puzzling, not because he was more devout in any personal emotional sense than a modern person might be, but because his world did not have the compartment. The divine was not a separate category of experience. It was woven into everything, present in the morning assembly and the evening meal, and the weapons inspection, and the road-building work party, and the moment before battle, when the formation pressed together and waited for the order to advance. The gods of the Roman world were not distant. They were not abstract theological principles or cosmic clockmakers who had set the universe in motion and then stepped back to observe. They were active. They intervened. They had preferences and moods and the capacity for both generosity and devastating anger. They could tip the scales of a battle, bring disease or health to a garrison, bless or ruin a harvest, protect a man on a night patrol, or withdraw their protection at a moment that turned out to be the last moment that protection was needed. The Roman approach to religion was therefore shaped by this fundamental understanding. The gods were neighbours of a particularly powerful and unpredictable kind, and maintaining good relations with them was not a spiritual luxury. It was a survival strategy. This is why the Roman approach to religious practice emphasized action over belief in the modern sense. You did not primarily need to feel the right things, or hold the correct internal convictions. You needed to do the right things, perform the sacrifices, keep the observances, honour the festivals, make the correct offerings at the correct times in the correct manner. The Roman word pietas, from which the English word piety derives, meant something closer to dutiful observance than to personal devotion, in the emotional sense we might attach to that word. A pious Roman was a Roman who fulfilled his religious obligations reliably and completely. The gods, in this understanding, were holding up their end of an implicit contract, and the Roman was expected to hold up his. Neglecting this contract had consequences that Romans took entirely seriously. An army that failed to perform its religious duties before a campaign was an army that had withdrawn its claim on divine protection. Military disasters could be and were interpreted in terms of failures of religious obligation. The story of the consul Claudius Pulcher, who during the First Punic War in the 3rd century BCE famously threw the sacred chickens into the sea when they refused to eat and therefore give a favourable omen for battle, saying with considerable bravado that if they would not eat they could drink, and then proceeded to lose the Battle of Drepana with spectacular completeness, was a story that the Roman military tradition kept alive and repeated precisely because it illustrated the point with such memorable clarity. You do not ignore the gods and win. The gods noticed, and they had a long memory. The formal religious calendar of the Roman military was, if you sit down with the evidence and look at it properly, genuinely remarkable in its density. The Feriad Duranum is a military calendar discovered in Egypt, dating to the early 3rd century CE, that lists the official religious observances the army was expected to keep throughout the year. Reading through it is a revealing experience. It is packed. There are commemorations of emperors living and deified, festivals for specific gods, observances tied to Rome's founding legends and historical events, celebrations connected to the military standards themselves, which were sacred objects as much as military insignia. The calendar made the year into a sequence of ritual punctuation marks, each one connecting the soldiers in that particular Egyptian posting to the broader ceremonial life of Rome and the empire. A man standing in the desert of Egypt, performing a sacrifice on the anniversary of the divine Augustus's birthday, was simultaneously a man at the edge of the world and a man at the center of a shared civilization. The ritual did both things at once. The gods most obviously connected to the military life were Mars, the god of war, whose name the month of March carries into the present day, and Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Jupiter the best and greatest, the king of the Roman divine pantheon, whose favour was considered essential to the legitimacy of Roman power in its entirety. Jupiter's eagle was the eagle. The aquila that each legion carried as its most sacred possession was Jupiter's bird, and the loss of a legion's eagle in battle was understood as something more than a military defeat. It was a withdrawal of divine favour from that unit, a catastrophe with spiritual dimensions that went beyond the tactical. Legions that lost their eagles went to sometimes extraordinary lengths to recover them, and the recovery of eagles lost in defeats was celebrated in Roman culture as a significant event. The emperor's genius also occupied a central place in military religious life. The genius, in Roman theological understanding, was the divine animating spirit of a person or a place, the essential divine force within them. The emperor's genius received regular veneration at the Principia shrine, the administrative and ceremonial heart of every Roman fort. Soldiers sacrificed to it. They swore by it. Their military oath, the sacramentum that bound them to their service with a force that Roman culture considered sacred and binding in the most serious possible sense, was sworn partly in the emperor's divine name. This was not purely political performance, though it served political functions. Roman soldiers genuinely believed in the divine character of imperial authority, as a theological reality embedded in the structure of the cosmos, rather than as a convenient political story. The man who broke the sacramentum was not merely a deserter. He was a man who had severed his relationship with the divine order, a status that the Roman mind found profoundly disturbing. What makes the Roman military's religious life particularly interesting, and this is the part that often surprises modern readers encountering it for the first time, is how thoroughly it absorbed and integrated divine traditions from every corner of the empire and beyond. The Roman soldiers' religion was not a closed system that excluded foreign gods. It was a spectacularly open one that welcomed them, identified them with existing Roman deities where the connection seemed natural, and incorporated their worship into the ongoing practice of men who were simultaneously maintaining their obligations to Mars and Jupiter and the emperor. Walk through the archaeological remains of forts in Roman Britain, and you find altars dedicated to gods who have British names, local divine presences that the Romans encountered and chose to honour. Coventina, a goddess associated with a sacred spring near Hadrian's Wall, received offerings from soldiers who were culturally Roman, but who apparently had no difficulty adding a local water deity to their devotional portfolio. The goddess Epona, originally worshipped among the Gaulish peoples of what is now France and neighbouring regions, was associated with horses, with journeys, with the transition between worlds. Roman cavalry units adopted her with such enthusiasm that her cult spread across the entire empire on the backs of horsemen who had been posted from Gaul to Britain to Syria to the Danube and carried their devotion with them. She appears on altars in places she'd never geographically originated from, carried there by soldiers who had decided she was worth honouring. Jupiter Dolichianus is another remarkable case. Originally a storm and war deity worshipped at Dolish in Syria, he was absorbed into the Roman divine world and became particularly popular among the military, spreading along the frontiers in the baggage of soldiers who had encountered him in the East and found his combination of attributes appealing. There is something genuinely moving about this pattern. the way individual soldiers encountered divine traditions in the territories they served in, and decided, on their own religious judgment, that these gods deserved attention. It reflects a fundamental openness in the Roman religious imagination, a willingness to acknowledge that divine power might express itself through forms that were not familiar from home. And then there is Mithras. The cult of Mithras occupies a special place in the history of Roman military religion, because of how specifically and intensely it attached itself to the soldier's world. Mithraism was a mystery religion, which meant it was organized around secret initiation rites and inner doctrines that initiates swore to keep private. The secrecy was real, and it was kept, which creates the slightly ironic situation that one of the most popular religions in the Roman military world is also one of the least well understood in terms of its actual theology and ritual content. The initiates did their job too well, from a historian's perspective. What we have instead is the physical evidence of the Mithraea themselves, the temples dedicated to Mithras that have been found at military sites from Britain to Syria, from the Rhine frontier to the Danube provinces, in numbers that make the distribution unmistakable. The temples were typically underground or semi-underground, long and narrow with benches along the sides where initiates reclined for ritual meals, and at the far end the central image of Mithras slaying a bull, the tauroctony, a dramatic composition of divine action that was common to all Mithraea, regardless of where they were built or when. The consistency of the image across such wide geography suggests a centralized tradition of teaching and iconography, though the details of what it all meant remain partly in shadow. What the cult offered the military man is legible even without the secret theology. Brotherhood among initiates, organized and real and ritually reinforced. A structured hierarchy of grades through which a member advanced, earning status and responsibility as he progressed. A structure that mapped naturally onto the military world of ranks and promotions, and the respect that came with demonstrated ability and tenure. A theology of cosmic struggle, of order against chaos, of endurance and sacrifice as meaningful acts in a universe where such things had consequences. These were not accidental features. They were the features of a religious offering precisely calibrated to the needs and values of the military man. Mithraism did not stumble into its military popularity. It earned it. Beyond the formal cults and the official calendar, the daily religious life of the soldier was personal and varied, and woven into ordinary moments. The amulet worn around the neck, a small bronze figure of a goddess, or a protective symbol of a kind familiar from the region the soldier came from, was not merely decorative. It was a practical spiritual technology, a maintained relationship with protective divine power that the soldier carried with him into every situation where protection was relevant, which in a military life was most situations. The votive offering made at a shrine in thanksgiving for a prayer answered was a transaction in the most literal sense, the human side of an exchange with divine power that the Roman mind understood as genuinely bilateral. The curse tablet tradition is one of the most vivid expressions of this personal religious agency. If someone had stolen Marcus's cloak, and theft within the military community happened despite all the institutional structures designed to prevent it, Marcus had recourse. He could take a thin sheet of lead, write on it a curse calling on underworld powers to identify and punish the thief, and deposit it at a sacred spring or shrine with the expectation that the divine powers he was appealing to would act. We have actual surviving examples of these tablets from Roman Britain, from the spring at Bath dedicated to the goddess Sulis Minerva, from sacred springs and shrines across the empire. They are specific and sometimes furious and occasionally darkly funny in their detail. A man who does not know which of his colleagues took his property, but is absolutely certain someone did, addressing the goddess with the particular mixture of formal religious language and personal grievance that the curse tablet genre permits, is recognizable across the full distance of 2,000 years. Divination belonged to both the personal and institutional religious worlds. Before a major campaign, Roman commanders performed the auspices. Sacred chickens were consulted. Animal entrails were examined. The flight of birds was observed and interpreted. The modern reader might be tempted toward condescension here, and I would gently push back against that temptation, not because I think the sacred chickens had reliable military intelligence, but because the practice served several real functions that had nothing to do with the accuracy of the omens. A divination ceremony before a major action created a collective ritual moment that focused attention and affirmed shared participation in something larger than the individual. It provided a mechanism for delaying action when the commander was not yet ready, without requiring him to admit tactical uncertainty. and it embedded the military campaign in a framework of cosmic significance that gave the men in the formation a sense that what they were doing mattered at a level beyond the merely human. The Roman soldier's religious world was in summary large. It was officially organised and personally supplemented. It was institutionally Roman and individually eclectic. It was serious without being solemn, practical without being cynical, and open in a way that the subsequent history of Western religion has sometimes made it difficult to appreciate. He carried his gods with him, from the eagle of Jupiter at the front of the column to the small amulet pressed against his skin under the armour. They were company on the long marches and comfort in the nights before uncertain days. In a world where so much was beyond his control, the gods were the thing he could do something about, and Marcus, being the practical Roman soldier that he was, did something about them regularly. Letters, money, and life beyond the legion. Let us talk about money for a moment, because I think it is one of those subjects that history tends to either skip over entirely or treat with a dry academic detachment that misses what makes it genuinely fascinating. The financial life of the Roman soldier was not glamorous. It was complicated, occasionally frustrating, meticulously documented, and in its details more revealing about the actual texture of military life than almost any other category of evidence we have. So let us look at it properly. A legionary in the early imperial period received a standard annual pay of roughly 225 denarii. This figure had been established by Julius Caesar's military reforms in the late Republic, and it remained broadly stable through much of the early empire, with periodic upward adjustments made by various emperors who understood, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, that an underpaid army was an army with interesting political opinions. 225 denarii per year. The question of whether this was a good wage or a poor one is genuinely complicated, because the answer depends entirely on what else you know about the economics of the Roman world, and the Roman economy was varied enough across time and geography that simple comparisons are treacherous. What we can say is that it was enough to live on, enough to save modestly over time, and not enough to make anyone rich during the service itself. But here is the thing about the 225 denarii that the nominal figure does not tell you. Marcus never actually received 225 denarii. Before he ever saw his pay, the institution that employed him had already helped itself to a substantial portion of it on his behalf. And whether you interpret that as considerate provision or infuriating presumption probably depended on your temperament and the specific deductions being made. The army deducted for food. This was the largest single deduction, which makes sense given that food was the largest single expense of keeping a soldier operational. But it meant that the grain ration and the supplementary provisions that Marcus consumed every day were not free. He was paying for them out of his wages, at rates set by the military rather than by negotiation. The army also deducted for equipment replacement and maintenance. When armour needed repairing or a sword needed replacing, the cost did not simply disappear into the institutional budget. It was tracked and eventually recovered from the soldier's account. The army deducted for the burial club, a collective fund into which every soldier paid so that if he died, wherever he died, the cost of his funeral and the appropriate religious observances would be covered. This was a practical arrangement of considerable benefit in a profession where the risk of dying far from home, in circumstances that left no obvious person responsible for the arrangements, was genuinely non-trivial, and the army deducted for the Saturnalia Fund, a contribution to the communal celebration of the Saturnalia festival that was apparently non-negotiable, regardless of how any individual soldier felt about communal celebrations. By the time all the deductions had been processed, the actual cash that arrived in Marcus's hand was notably and sometimes startlingly less than the headline figure. There is a surviving papyrus from Roman Egypt, one of the most extraordinary documents in the entire archive of Roman military life, that records the individual financial account of a soldier named Quintus Julius Proculus. It shows his gross pay, his deductions itemized with careful specificity, and his net receipt. Reading it is one of those moments where the ancient world suddenly becomes very immediate, because the experience of looking at a payslip and feeling a complicated mixture of gratitude and slight grievance about the gap between the gross and the net figure is remarkably constant across 2,000 years of human experience. The man responsible for managing these accounts at the century level was the signifer, the standard bearer who also served as the unit's banker. The signifer maintained individual accounts for each soldier, recording deposits and withdrawals and running balances with the kind of careful attention that the position required. Soldiers could voluntarily deposit money into their accounts beyond what the deductions had already taken, saving for future needs, or simply keeping the money somewhere more secure than a personal hiding spot in the barrack room. The money was held at the Principia, the headquarters building, which was the most secure location in the fort and which also housed the unit's sacred standards. Whether the combination of financial records and divine presence in the same building was deliberate theology or practical security is an interesting question that the Romans did not feel the need to explain. The accounts that survive from Roman military papyri in Egypt preserve the actual financial lives of specific soldiers with a granularity that no other ancient source quite matches. You can trace a man's pay across multiple cycles, watch him make deposits and withdrawals, see the deductions come out and the remainder go in. You can sometimes infer from the pattern of the account something about what was happening in the soldier's life. A sudden withdrawal might be money sent home. A period of consistent saving followed by a large withdrawal might be a significant purchase. The financial record is a kind of shadow biography, telling a story in numbers that the letters tell in words. And then there was the prize at the end. The premia, the discharge payment that a legionary received after completing 25 years of honourable service, was set by Augustus at 12,000 sestertii, which is equivalent to 3,000 denarii, which is roughly 13 times the nominal annual pay. This was real money, significant money, enough to buy a small farm in certain provinces, enough to set yourself up in a trade or a craft in a town, enough to be the financial foundation of a genuinely different kind of life from the one you'd been living for the previous quarter of a century. The premia was the promised land of Roman military service, the thing you thought about when the posting was cold, and the centurion was unpleasant, and the food was exactly the same as it had been for the past 3 years. 25 years and you would be paid enough to begin again. The calculation kept a lot of men at their posts through a lot of difficult winters. For auxiliary soldiers, the non-citizen troops recruited from the provinces, the financial equation was different in its structure but comparable in its logic. Auxiliaries were paid less than legionaries. The pay differential was real and the auxiliaries were aware of it and occasionally articulate about their feelings on the subject. But what they received at discharge was in some respects more significant than the premia, because what they received was Roman citizenship, a bronze diploma recording the grant issued in the emperor's name, conferring on the discharged auxiliary, and in many cases on his children, the full legal rights and social status of Roman citizens. In a world where citizenship carried genuine legal and economic advantages, where being a citizen meant access to Roman courts and Roman property law and the Roman inheritance system, this was not a symbolic gesture. It was a material benefit with real consequences for the rest of a man's life. Now let us set the financial ledger aside for a moment and talk about letters, because the correspondence that Roman soldiers produced is among the most directly moving evidence of their inner lives that the historical record preserves, and it deserves more than a footnote. The Vindolanda tablets are wooden writing tablets found at the fort of Vindolanda just south of Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, dating from the late 1st and early 2nd century CE. They were written on thin slivers of wood, scratched with a stylus in a cursive Latin script that took scholars considerable effort to decipher when the tablets were first discovered in the 1970s. What the decipherment revealed was a collection of personal and administrative correspondence of extraordinary immediacy, the actual words of people who lived on the Roman frontier 2,000 years ago, preserved by the waterlogged conditions of the fort's rubbish heap, which is either deeply unglamorous or a reminder that history is preserved by accident rather than intention. Among the tablets is a letter from a soldier, the correspondent uncertain but the content entirely clear, asking someone back home to send supplies. The list of requested items is specific. 2 pairs of socks, 2 pairs of sandals, 2 pairs of underpants. That is the list. And I want to dwell on it for a moment, not because it is dramatic, but because it is the opposite of dramatic in a way that makes it remarkable. A man on the Roman frontier 2,000 years ago writing to someone who cared about him well enough to send packages, asking for socks and sandals and underpants. The 2 pairs of everything, that careful doubling, implies a practical anticipation that 1 pair might wear out before the next opportunity for resupply arrived. It is the logic of someone who's been a long way from reliable supply chains long enough to think about these things systematically. That letter requires no translation of human context, none at all. It is simply a person far from home, cold and practical, asking for warm things. The distance between that moment and this one collapses entirely when you read it. There is also the birthday invitation, and this one I find even more affecting, which I realise says something about my own sensibilities. Claudia Severa writes to Sulpicia Lepidinum, inviting her to come to her birthday celebration. The letter begins formally, the scribe's practiced hand moving through the standard opening formulas of Roman epistolary convention. Then, toward the end, the handwriting changes. It becomes slightly less polished, slightly more personal. A different hand takes over, and what follows is a few lines of genuine warmth, the woman herself writing directly rather than dictating, adding something that the formal scribble process could not quite capture. She calls Lepidina her sister, a term of affection rather than biological relation. She says she hopes to see her. The warmth is immediate and completely without distance. Two women on the edge of the Roman world, maintaining a friendship across the distances that military postings imposed, using the best technology their era had available, which was a thin piece of wood and a sharp stylus, and a courier willing to carry it. The human effort in that letter, the choosing of words and the personal addition at the end, and the hope that it would reach its destination and prompt a response, is entirely recognisable. What soldiers wrote home tells us, in aggregate, what soldiers thought about. They thought about their health, and they reported on it carefully, because everyone they had left behind was worrying about it. They asked about the health of the people they had left, specifically and by name, because they were worrying about it from a distance. They made practical requests for things that were not available at the posting, medicines and foodstuffs and tools and clothing, the specific items implying a knowledge of what was available where, and a careful marshalling of the requests into what was most needed. They sent money home when they had accumulated enough to make it worthwhile, the flow of small wages crossing enormous distances to contribute to family economies that depended partly on that contribution. The economic relationship between soldiers and their families was not simply the soldier sending money outward. It flowed in both directions and with some regularity. Families sent money to soldiers who had run short. Families sent goods that the posting did not supply. The financial and material connection between the man in the fort and the people in the place he came from was maintained across the years, and the distances through exactly this kind of practical exchange, a flow of resources and requests and acknowledgements that constituted a form of continued participation in family life, even from a very long way away. The personal lives that soldiers built outside the formal structure of the Legion deserve acknowledgement as something that the official sources persistently underplay, partly because those sources were written by and for the institutional perspective, and partly because the informal lives of ordinary soldiers were not considered significant enough to document carefully. Roman military law prohibited soldiers from contracting legal marriages during their service, a prohibition that was in force through much of the early imperial period. This is true and it is important. It is also only part of the story. The Vici, the civilian settlements that grew up around established forts, and which we mentioned earlier in the context of the fort's physical surroundings, were full of the actual lives that soldiers were living beyond the barracks wall. Soldiers formed relationships with local women. They had children with those women. They maintained those households across the years of their posting, contributing to them financially, spending off-duty time there, building something that functioned as family life in all its practical and emotional dimensions regardless of what the legal framework chose to call it. When a soldier was eventually discharged, he could formalize these relationships, legitimize his children, marry in the legal Roman sense. Many did. The children of soldiers were a significant demographic in frontier communities across the empire, and they followed their fathers into the legions with a regularity that created multi-generational military families attached to specific units and specific regions over generations. This was the life that existed alongside the official one, the life the institution did not formally recognize but also did not seriously attempt to suppress, because suppression would have been both practically difficult and strategically unwise. Men with families nearby were men with a stake in the stability of the region. Men who had built lives outside the barracks were men who had reasons beyond duty and pay to keep the frontier functioning. Marcus, in his barracks room on a quiet evening, lamp guttering against the dark, a piece of writing material across his knee, composing the careful words of a letter to whoever waited for him at whatever distance, was not only a soldier, he was a person. The institution had shaped him profoundly, had taken the young man who walked through the recruitment gate and remade him in specific and lasting ways, but it had not made him only a soldier. The letter was evidence of the self that the uniform did not cover, the connections that 25 years of service could not sever, the loves and obligations and history that persisted underneath everything the Legion had added. He folded the letter carefully, addressed it to whoever it was going to, and set it aside for the morning's dispatch. Outside, the night watch continued its slow rotation through the dark. The soldier grows old. Promotion, retirement, and legacy. 25 years is a very long time. Long enough for a young man to become a middle-aged one. Long enough for the world outside the Legion to change considerably. Long enough for the institution itself to evolve, for emperors to rise and fall, for provinces to change character, for the military situation on the frontiers to shift and shift again. The Roman soldier who survived his full term of service and was honourably discharged was a profoundly different person from the one who had taken the sacramentum a quarter of a century earlier. The career of a Roman legionary was structured by a system of promotion that was more meritocratic than many modern readers might expect from an ancient institution, though with the usual caveats about the ways in which connections and favour operated alongside formal assessments of ability. A soldier who distinguished himself through competence, courage, and the willingness to take responsibility could advance through a series of positions within the century and the cohort that brought increased pay, reduced unpleasant duties, and increased status. The first rungs of the promotion ladder were the various special positions within the century. The tesserarius, who was responsible for organising the guard and communicating the watchword, the optio, who served as the centurion's deputy, and the aquilifer and signifer, who held the prestigious standard-bearer roles. Each of these positions came with pay supplements above the basic legionary rate, and with the exemption from certain routine duties that made them desirable. The position that every ambitious Roman soldier with the aptitude and the luck aspired to was, of course, the centurionate. Making centurion was the great career achievement of the Roman non-commissioned officer class, and it changed the character of a man's experience in the legion dramatically. A centurion commanded 80 men. He was responsible for their training, their discipline, their welfare, and their performance in the field. He held a position of genuine authority that was recognized across the entire military institution. He received significantly more pay than any common soldier. He had his own room rather than sharing the barrack room. He had a vine staff. Centurions who distinguished themselves could advance through the centuriate in a graded system, with the most senior and prestigious position being the primus pilus, the first spear, the centurion of the first century of the first cohort. The primus pilus was one of the most significant military figures in the entire legion, respected by officers and men alike, with a level of institutional knowledge and practical experience that no freshly appointed legate could match. After his year in the primus pilus position, a soldier could be promoted to the equestrian class and pursue a further career as a prefect commanding auxiliary units or other senior posts. For most soldiers, however, the career ended not with spectacular promotion, but with honourable discharge, the onesta missio, which was the formal acknowledgement that a soldier had served his full term and was released from his obligations. The ceremony of discharge was significant in the life of the unit. The departing soldiers were formally named, their service record recited, their rewards confirmed. For auxiliary soldiers, citizenship was formally conferred at this point, and a bronze document called a diploma was issued recording the grant with the emperor's authority behind it. What happened next was the beginning of a new life that was shaped entirely by the old one. The land grant that had historically been part of the discharge settlement meant that many veterans settled in colonies, communities of former soldiers established in strategic locations across the empire. These veteran communities served a dual purpose. They provided the veterans with the agricultural land that was their reward, and they spread Romanized settlement into frontier zones, creating stable communities of Latin-speaking, Roman law-observing, culturally Roman people in places that had previously been less thoroughly integrated into the imperial system. The veterans brought their military experience with them into civilian life. Former soldiers served in local militias and town watch organizations. They contributed to the construction of public buildings in their communities. They served on town councils. They brought the organizational habits of the Legion into the fabric of local civic life. The impact of veterans on the cultural and social character of frontier communities was significant and lasting. Some veterans chose to remain near their previous postings, settling in the vici that had grown up around their forts and formalizing the families they had created during service. Others returned to their regions of origin, sometimes after 2.5 decades of absence, returning as substantially different people to places that had also changed in the interval. The tombstones of Roman soldiers are among the most directly human artifacts of the Roman military world. Many have survived, carved with the soldier's name and unit and length of service and age at death, and occasionally a brief personal inscription or a portrait carving. They record both the men who died in service, sometimes in battle, more often of illness or accident, and the men who survived their full term and died afterward as veterans. Reading these stones is a particular kind of historical experience. Each one is a specific person: Caius Julius Apollinaris, Marcus Aurelius Superianus, Lucius Petronius Florentinus. Names from a world that ended 2,000 years ago, still insisting on their individuality against the weight of time. These men built the world that made the world we live in. That is not hyperbole. It is the simple historical reality. Evening. The day. Winds down. The evening meal was the main meal of the Roman soldiers' day, and the one that had the most social texture around it. After the afternoon's duties were complete and the day's final roster duties settled, the contubernia came together in the way that was the most fundamental social unit of military life, the 8 men who shared their world sharing also their food. The cooking arrangements in a Roman barracks were organised at the contubernium level. The group had its own cooking equipment, which was typically kept in the outer room of their 2-room allocation, and meals were prepared communally. The basic staple was grain, prepared most commonly as bread or as a thick porridge called pulse. The grain was issued to the unit, and the soldiers did much of their own milling and baking, using the communal ovens that were a feature of the barracks layout. Roman military bread was a round, dense loaf that could sustain a soldier on a long march, and did not require elaborate preparation. Beyond the bread and porridge, the evening meal would have included whatever was available from the fort's supply arrangements. Lentils appeared frequently in the Roman military diet, legumes being a good source of protein and calories that stored well and prepared easily. Vegetables of various kinds depending on the season and the region of the posting. Pork and mutton and beef appeared with reasonable regularity, supplemented by whatever could be hunted or purchased locally from the surrounding community. Fish sauce, the ubiquitous garum of Roman cuisine, functioned as a seasoning and flavouring agent that appears in Roman recipes of all social levels, from the grandest to the most basic. It was, by all accounts, extremely pungent in its undiluted form, but the Romans loved it the way certain modern cultures love fermented fish products, which is to say with an intensity that slightly baffles everyone else. Salt was another critical condiment, and there is an old story about the word salary deriving from the Latin for salt salarium, based on the idea that Roman soldiers were paid in salt. This is almost certainly not literally true, but salt was extremely valuable in the ancient world, used for food preservation on a scale that the modern world has largely moved past, and soldiers were given a salt ration that was a genuine part of their material provision. The evening meal was eaten in the warm dimness of the inner barrack room, by lamplight as the day faded, with the particular relaxed quality that the end of a day's work can produce when the work is done, and there is no immediate further demand. This was the hour of conversation and argument and storytelling, the hour when the military day loosened its formal grip slightly, and the personal lives of the men reasserted themselves. The stories that Roman soldiers told each other in their barrack rooms would have been a remarkable collection, if any had been written down. Campaign memories, local legends absorbed from the frontier territories, jokes, some of which survive in other contexts and suggest a sensibility that would not be entirely unfamiliar to modern audiences. Complaints about the centurion, a perennial and apparently inexhaustible topic. Speculation about where the unit might be sent next, which was the kind of conversation that military people have engaged in since the beginning of organised armies, and which never seems to produce reliable information but never stops happening. There was also music. Roman soldiers played instruments, and finds from military sites include fragments of musical instruments alongside the weapons and tools. The carnix-like instruments used in Roman military signalling represent one end of the musical spectrum, but personal instruments, small lyres or pipes or drums, appear in various forms in the archaeological and artistic record of the legions. After the evening meal, as the light fully left the sky, came the preparations for the night. The fort's night watch was organised and assigned. The passwords for the night were issued. The gates were secured. The patrols within the fort itself, moving through the streets between the buildings, began their nocturnal rounds, and most of the garrison settled toward whatever sleep the night would allow them. Marcus, in the middle of this settling, would have attended to the end-of-day maintenance of his equipment if he had not already done so. A soldier's gear was his life insurance in the most literal sense, and the habit of keeping it ready was so deeply ingrained that it persisted through exhaustion and cold and the accumulated weariness of a full day. The sword was checked and sheathed. The shield was propped in its usual place. The armour was adjusted to the degree that the morning's inspection required. Then, With the economy of movement that comes from doing the same things in the same small space every night, he settled into whatever sleeping arrangement his barracks offered. The sounds of the fort at night were different from the sounds of the day. The institutional noise of drill and work and the bustle of hundreds of men moving and talking gave way to the smaller sounds of a large community quieting. Distant voices, the footsteps of the night watch, the sounds of the animals, horses and mules and dogs that were part of any military establishment. Wind moving across stone walls, the fire in the bathhouse still burning, visible as a glow against the dark if you were standing in the right place. It was, all in all, a world that had its own beauty if you were in the mood to notice it, and even Roman soldiers, it seems, sometimes were. The night watch. Darkness, stars and silence. The night watch was the most solitary duty in the Roman soldier's rotation, and it had a quality distinct from anything else in the military day. During the day, a soldier was almost always part of a group, embedded in the social machinery of the sentry and the contubernium, visible and accountable and surrounded by the activity of the institution. At night, standing his watch on the wall or walking his patrol through the dark streets of the fort, he was as alone as he was likely to get. The Roman watch system on the frontier walls and at fort gates was carefully organised. Pairs or small groups of soldiers were stationed at key points, with the watch organised in shifts that rotated through the night. The tesserarius of the sentry was responsible for organising the guard and for communicating the watchword, the tessera, which was the security token of the night. Each night had its own watchword, issued at headquarters and communicated down through the command structure. At regular intervals during the night, a supervisory round was made to check that guards were at their posts and awake, with the officer conducting the round carrying the actual physical token that the guards were supposed to verify before admitting him. The Roman military was serious about the mechanical aspects of night security. There is an account preserved in the sources describing the exact procedure by which the watchword was distributed and checked, which reveals a system of remarkable bureaucratic thoroughness. Tokens were passed from post to post, checked and verified, returned to headquarters with signatures or marks confirming their passage. This was security theatre in the best sense, not because it was merely symbolic, but because the ritual of checking and verification was itself the mechanism by which the security was maintained. Standing watch in the dark had a particular quality that no amount of training quite prepared you for, because it was not primarily a physical challenge, it was a psychological one. The human nervous system in darkness, in relative silence, with the knowledge of potential threat, does interesting and not always welcome things. Shapes suggest themselves in shadows. Sounds acquire ambiguous character. The imagination, without the anchor of visual information to constrain it, tends toward the dramatic. Roman soldiers on the frontier wall were watching for real threats that were genuinely there, at least in potential. Beyond the wall was territory that was not fully controlled, populated by people who might or might not be friendly, depending on the current state of relations. A raiding party could move in darkness. A probe of the defences could come at night, testing the gaps in the watch, looking for the place where the guard was asleep or inattentive. The discipline that kept soldiers awake and alert through the long hours of the watch was not arbitrary. It was the basic requirement of survival in a contested environment. But the night watch was also sometimes simply quiet. On peaceful nights when nothing stirred beyond the walls and the stars were bright overhead, the watch had an austere beauty that even the most practically minded soldier would have found it difficult to entirely ignore. The Roman world was a world of extraordinary darkness by modern standards. There was no light pollution. On a clear night on the frontier, the sky was thick with stars in a way that modern eyes in modern cities almost never see. The Milky Way would have been a visible band of light across the sky. The planets moved through their courses in ways that the educated could identify, and the rest could appreciate as something larger than themselves moving in orderly patterns through the dark. Roman soldiers knew the sky. They had to, in a practical sense, because the stars were part of how time was measured at night, and how direction was maintained on long marches. But there is also evidence that the sky meant something more to them than the merely practical. The religious dimension of the stars, the planets identified with gods, the constellations carrying mythological narratives, would have been familiar to any educated Roman. Standing on a dark wall at the third watch of the night, with nothing happening and nothing requiring action, the stars overhead were company of a kind. The night watch also produced its own specific social tradition, the challenge and response between the soldier on watch and anyone approaching. The challenge, the calling out of the watchword demand, and the response, providing the correct word, was a small ritual of recognition that occurred dozens of times each night across the fort. It was a brief moment of human contact in the long solitary stretch, a confirmation that the other person was who they were supposed to be and that the system was functioning correctly. What soldiers thought about during the long quiet hours of the night watch was not recorded in any systematic way, but we can make reasonable inferences from what we know of them as people. They thought about home, because people separated from home always think about it, and the night with its quiet encouraged a kind of reflective mood that the busy daytime suppressed. They thought about women they loved or hoped to see again. They thought about their families, about whether the letters they had sent had arrived, about what was happening in the towns and provinces they had left behind. They may have thought about what they had done in battle and what it had felt like, the kind of processing that the quiet hours permit and the active ones do not. They also, almost certainly, thought about ordinary things, what they were going to eat when they got off watch, whether the sentry was going to draw a work party assignment tomorrow, whether the weather was going to change. The small anxieties and hopes and irritations that make up the texture of any life, regardless of how dramatic its external circumstances might be. The night watch ended with the arrival of the relief, another small group of soldiers trudging through the dark to take their turn on the wall. The handover was brief and formal, the watchword confirmed, the post transferred, and Marcus, if he was the man coming off watch, turned back toward the barracks and the remaining hours before dawn, moving through a fort that was quiet but not empty, through the managed darkness of the institution he served, toward his bunk and whatever sleep the remaining night would give him. It was a good system, all things considered. Not comfortable, not glamorous, not the stuff of the stories told about Rome, but real, functional, human, and in the long view of history, remarkably effective. The legacy of the Roman soldier. When the Roman Empire began its long decline, when the frontiers it had maintained for centuries began to give way under pressures internal and external, when the last Western emperor was deposed in 476 CE, the legions that had built and maintained the world's most remarkable ancient empire passed from the stage of active history. But they did not disappear. They left behind something that turned out to be more durable than any individual battle or campaign, a set of material, institutional, and cultural legacies that shaped everything that came after them. The most literal legacies are the ones you can still walk on. Roman roads in Britain still trace their paths through the landscape, followed by modern lanes and footpaths that took the line of least resistance and found that the Romans had already identified it 2,000 years ago. The A2 road in England, running from London to Canterbury and beyond, follows the line of the Roman Watling Street. The A1, running north from London, follows Ermine Street. In France, the network of Roman roads is embedded in the modern road system in ways that satellite mapping has only recently made fully visible. In the Middle East, roads built or improved by Roman legions still carry traffic in some areas. The walls are still there. Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, built by the legions under the Emperor Hadrian beginning around 122 CE, is one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world. Walking along its course, which still stands to several courses of stone in many places and extends for 73 miles across the narrowest part of Britain, is one of those historical experiences that makes the past physically present in an almost overwhelming way. The wall was built by the soldiers of 3 legions, the 2nd Augusta, the 6th Victrix, and the 20th Valeria Victrix, and different sections are marked with building inscriptions that name the units responsible. These inscriptions are still readable. The soldiers who built those sections left their names in the stone. The forts that supported the wall are also there, partially excavated, their foundations visible in the turf. Vindolanda, which has given us the extraordinary tablets we have discussed throughout this narrative, continues to be excavated, and each excavation season produces new finds from the ancient garbage heaps that preserve the material of daily life. In the summer months, you can watch archaeologists in the trench uncovering the remains of the world we have spent tonight inhabiting. The institutional legacy of the Roman military is harder to see but at least as significant. Every modern Western military tradition has the Roman military somewhere in its family tree. The rank structures that organize modern armies, the concept of the professional standing army, the emphasis on training and drill as the foundation of military effectiveness, the integration of engineering and logistics into military operations, the understanding that supply and infrastructure are as decisive as fighting power, all of these trace their lineage in complex ways through medieval European military traditions that were themselves shaped by what survived of Roman practice. The language of the Roman military persists in surprising places. The word centurion is still used, as is the word legion and the word tribune. The word mile derives from the Latin millipasuum, 1,000 paces, the standard Roman measurement of distance. The word camp comes from campus, the Latin word for a level field, by way of the military associations of the word. The salary connection to salarium we mentioned earlier, true or not as etymology, has passed into the language of employment. The military tradition of precise measurement and documentation of distance and time that the Roman legions practiced contributed to the standardization of measurement systems that eventually fed into modern metrology. The demographic legacy is also real and occasionally strange. The Roman military moved people around the empire on a scale that was extraordinary for the ancient world. Soldiers recruited in one province and stationed in another for 25 years, then retired in yet another, created flows of population and genetic mixing across the empire that modern DNA research is only beginning to trace. There are people in the north of England whose ancestry includes soldiers from North Africa and Syria and the Danube provinces, because those soldiers served on Hadrian's Wall and stayed when their service ended. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Roman soldier, however, is the one that is the hardest to quantify. It is the demonstration that human beings organized into a disciplined, trained, supplied, and internally coherent institution can achieve things that no collection of individuals could approach. The Roman legions built a world, roads and walls and bridges and forts and cities, and the administrative infrastructure that held an empire of 80 million people together across 3 continents for centuries. They did this with iron tools and human muscle and organizational genius, and the accumulated disciplinary wisdom of centuries of institutional refinement. They were not superhuman. They were cold and tired and homesick and hungry and sometimes terrified. They gambled and complained and wrote letters asking for socks. They prayed to gods they could not see about battles they were not sure they would survive. They were to a degree that makes the achievement both more remarkable and more comprehensible, simply people. And what those people built in the aggregate across the centuries of Rome's military history was the physical and institutional foundation of Western civilization as it subsequently developed. The roads that Christianity travelled as it spread across the empire, the legal traditions that eventually fed into the legal systems of modern Europe, the engineering knowledge that persisted through the Middle Ages in modified forms, the organisational concepts that shaped every subsequent European military tradition. The Roman soldier, the ordinary one, the man who built more than he fought and marched more than he charged and spent more of his career digging than heroic sword fighting, that man deserves to be remembered. He built the world. The least we can do is know his name. And so the day ends. The fort is quiet now. The last watch is at its posts, and the hours before dawn have that particular stillness that belongs to the deep of the night, when even the most restless thing in the world finds its moment of rest. The lamps in the barrack rooms have gone out one by one. The sounds of the evening's conversation have faded. The smell of the evening meal has settled into the cold air of the corridors between the buildings. Marcus is asleep. He's lying in the small inner room of his barrack section, his bunkmates breathing around him in the dark, his equipment in its proper place in the outer room, ready for tomorrow's inspection, ready for whatever the morning call requires. His body, which has carried him 20 miles, or dug a ditch, or stood a wall for hours, or built a section of road, is resting with the completeness that only real physical work can produce. His dreams, if they come, are his own business, and the institution that governs his waking hours has no jurisdiction there. Outside the walls of the fort, the frontier landscape is dark and quiet, stars bright above. The watchfires visible at intervals along the wall, the distant sound of an animal somewhere in the territory beyond, a sound that the man on the wall hears and assesses and categorizes as harmless, turning his attention back to the middle distance, to the dark horizon that he's been watching for hours and will watch for hours more. The Roman world is sleeping, or trying to. In the cities to the south and west, in Rome itself, people are also finding the end of their days, merchants closing their stalls, senators finishing their conversations, children being put to bed with the small rituals of the ancient world. The empire is enormous and diverse and complicated and sometimes brutal and sometimes remarkably tender, and it is doing what all large organisms do in the night, resting, digesting, preparing to begin again with the dawn. In the barracks, someone shifts in their sleep. One of the 7 others murmurs something without waking. The sound of breathing settles into a pattern, 8 people at different points in the depth of sleep, a familiar sound that has its own kind of comfort after the years of sharing this small space. You stop noticing it consciously. It becomes the sound of safety, of not being alone, of the particular peace that the military day eventually arrives at after its long and demanding hours. The stars move, the watches turn, the passwords are exchanged in the dark in the brief rituals of recognition and security. The world turns, as it always has and always will, through the hours between the day's end and the day's beginning. Let the day's details soften now, the drilling and the digging and the marching and the watching. Let the names and the dates and the distances ease back into the comfortable blur of the past. History does not demand to be held tightly. It offers itself as a companion, a context, a reminder that the world has been full of people before us, people who were tired and cold and a long way from home, and still, somehow, managed to do the extraordinary things that made the world we inhabit. Let your breathing slow to something like Marcus's rhythm, the deep, unconscious breath of a body that has done its work and earned its rest. The night watch is on. Someone else is paying attention to the dark horizon. You can rest now. The fire in the bathhouse is burning low, just enough warmth to take the edge off the night. The stones of the wall hold the last of the day's heat against the cold that presses in from the north. The last awake man in the barracks pulls his blanket tighter and thinks, briefly and without urgency, about something he means to write in his next letter home. And then that thought dissolves too, into the dark, into the quiet, into the long, deep tide of sleep that takes everyone eventually, from the greatest emperor to the most ordinary foot soldier standing his watch on the farthest edge of the known world. The stars above Hadrian's Wall are very bright tonight. They always were. Sleep well. Good night, wherever you are listening from. I always love seeing the places that join us for these late-night dives into history. If tonight's journey carried you somewhere interesting, or if it carried you all the way to sleep, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. We will be back for another journey soon. Until then, rest well.